Lozzie took a heartbeat to absorb my foolish request. Perhaps she couldn't believe her ears. I could hardly blame her, not when I'd been so adamant in my rejection only minutes earlier, so horrified, so afraid. It's not every day somebody offers to dive headfirst into their own trauma. Eventually I looked away from the knight inside the open suit of armor, away from the fleshy, tea-stained colored, living core of intent that had set itself the task of protecting us. We broke our tentacle handshake by silent mutual agreement, and the knight slowly retracted its feelers too. Lozzie was staring at me, blinking sleepy eyes, mouth open but stalled. One of her hands was bunched in the pastel fabric of her poncho. Her goat skull mask hung from the other by one horn. The trip elsewhere, I repeated. Let's do it. Together. My voice quivered but rang unbroken, gentle echoes lost across this endless quiet plain of yellow grass, beneath the soft purple light of a whorled and spiraled sky. You really mean it? Lozzie asked, her voice barely louder than her breath. I nodded, then wiped the thread of tears on my sleeve and held out a hand toward her. Yes. A hiccup got in the way and made me roll my eyes. Don't make me repeat it again, please. I'll lose all my courage. Heathy, she accepted my outstretched hand. Lozzie's elfin little smile bounced back onto her face as she rocked on the balls of her feet, but the smile was extinguished again when she bit her bottom lip. I don't want to force you. You said you're not like me, and you're right, we're really not really, not in the way it really matters out. We might not be exactly the same thing, yes, I said, trying to keep my voice free of quiver and shiver. But since when does that matter? For pity's sake, if I don't do this now then I'll never do it. I might never have the courage again. I might never find the guts to ask you a second time. And Lozzie, I need every edge I can find. You've given me one, given us 150 ones. I gestured at the knights of Lozzie's imaginary round table, spread out across the yellow hillsides, and at our specific friend still standing there and holding its armor apart like a shelled mollusk. But if I can find another by facing, my voice began to shake. I'm not a scared little girl anymore. You've been out there and you've come back fine. Lozzie pulled an awkward toothy smile and did a little bird-like bob of her head. Fine is relative. You are fine, I almost snapped. No matter what anybody says about you. Lozzie scrunched her eyes up like a cat. She went. I need every edge I can acquire if I'm going to take Maisie back from the eye. I need to find my limits. I thought this was one. I glanced at the knights again. But it's not. Take me elsewhere, Lozzie, please. To interesting places. Show me. Because I might learn something, maybe about myself. Oh, Heathy. Lozzie, her arms around my neck in a sudden hug. I hugged her back, as much to still my racing heart as to acknowledge her joy, and briefly felt her heart beating inside her own chest against mine. I could not have asked for a better source of comfort. She pulled away as quickly as she had embraced me, squeezing my arms and then my hands, nodding enthusiastically. Yes. We can do it. And it doesn't have to be long because you want to get back for dinner, but it'll be real and I promise it's safe, and yes. She laughed and bounced back on her heels, but held on tight to one of my hands. I smiled back as I let out a long, slow, shaking breath, marred only slightly by a loud hiccup at the end. Truth was, I was still terrified and I didn't try to hide it. What was the point? I knew what I was doing, and why I was doing it. I'd made my choice. It was time. Lozzie dipped her head in a wave of wispy blonde hair and slipped the goat skull mask back over her features, then straightened up, once more tucked away behind shadow and bone, topped with horns, fey and alien. You'll have to get me one of those, I said, purely to distract from the fluttering in my stomach. We could. I think. I don't know. Maybe. I forced out a tiny laugh and pulled my hoodie tighter around myself, drawing my 6 tentacles inward toward my body, I wrapped two of them around my torso in a self-hug and allowed another to creep down my own arm to grasp Lassie's wrist. I would not lose my grip on her, no matter where we went. "It's okay, I won't let go, I promise," she chirped. I managed a nod. "Come come," she called out, and the two knights she'd called over previously now got into position again, flanking her shoulders. The one which had opened its armor set about retracting the metal back into place, pulling muscles tight like a clam to seal itself away inside the shell of perfect chrome once more. A tendril flicked out through the final closing gap between cuirass and pauldron, angled up and pointing at me, then slipped inside before the armor closed completely. Once again, a knight in shining armor stood there, with no hint as to what roiling flesh lay hidden inside. I burst out laughing in a release of tension. The absurdity was too much. "Heathy." Lassie twitched her head side to side like a curious puppy, another gesture she shared with Tenny. The re-armored knight stepped into position and placed a metal gauntlet on Lassie's shoulder to mirror the one on her other side. "It gave me a thumbs up," I said through the laughter. "Very sweet." Lassie beamed up at the knight, but it did not react, sealed as it was in metal once more. Perhaps it did respond, inside the dark privacy of that armor. Perhaps that's why they seemed so impassive, all talking mind to mind without the need for external expression. I hoped they were happy. "Ready?" Lassie asked with a teasing lilt. My heart hammered against the cage of my ribs and my mouth was suddenly very dry. I almost said no. Keep it moderate, please," I said instead. "Nowhere too extreme. Places we've been before, perhaps." "Mhm. Lassie nodded along, the goat skull mask bouncing up and down. "And whatever you do," I blurted out and felt stupid, "don't actually take me to Wonderland." "Heather," Lassie purred. I know, I didn't need to say it, I'm sorry, it just scares me, it's always in the back of my head." "I know you wouldn't." "I don't want to go back there either," Lassie said. I could hear the wrinkled nose in her tone even through the weight of the bone mask. "Quite right." "Then I'm ready," I said with butterflies in my stomach. My tentacle squeezed tighter on Lassie's wrist. I had to resist the urge to armorplate myself. Lassie swung our joined hands up into the air with my tentacle along for the ride. Her goat skull mask turned to meet my gaze. In the second before we departed I felt a brief flicker of dissociation, a sense of looking in the mirror and not seeing oneself but in reverse. I felt as if I was looking at Lassie's real face, or the closest thing possible. "I love you," she said, then, reality folded up. Mile-long godworms digested endless lava flows of molten metal and defecated it out as living, green biomass that exploded into verdant plant life, while Lassie and I watched from an outcrop that had already ossified into bone, a sky filled with plate creatures each the size of a continent, all of them with unique ecosystems riding on their backs, singing songs in the upper atmosphere loud enough to shatter rock. And we tiny little apes protected inside a bubble of air which Lassie conjured. From her knight's shields as she sang in response, the castle where she'd taken me before, wrapped in a thick blanket of snow and tucked away in a mountain valley, beauty sublime enough to break to my heart, but quieter than before, as if the snow had never stopped falling and the inhabitants had grown fewer, under the watchful eye of the giant bird which perched on a distant peak and watched the fortress, as if laying siege with the power of thought. A giggle and a huddle and a game of knots and crosses in the dancing sand of a place far too hot for unprotected human flesh, but where Lassie kicked her shoes off and trod without a care, and I coaxed my bioreactor to power a pair of heat-sink sails and pad my outer dermis with coolant. I did not come away from that last one unscathed, back bruised in new places and skin tender, all aching and raw from growing fresh pneumosomatic body parts. Lassie massaged my muscles as we lay in a cradle of vines, high up in the canopy of a rotting jungle beneath a sun the color of dead peach. "We can go back if you want," she chirped from beneath the bone mask. She did not take it off in these depths. "It's been hours and hours and hours." "Not yet," I croaked, and forced my hand back into hers, past my better judgment. She sang to beetle-backed crustaceans with heads of writhing fingers, that talked to each other in a language of color and pheromone. She convinced them we were only there to watch the distant mushroom towers unfold like giant sunflowers, though the towers pointed not at a sun, but at a mass of suborbital glowing bone like a giant tumor of the sky. There was another castle, one I liked less, built for things shaped so much larger than we little monkeys, with no windows and no doors, only endless dark pressing in on the tiny bubble of light cast from the tips of the knight's lances. We left there quickly when things began to move in the shadows, shapes that made me want to scream and bristle and cover myself with warning spines and toxic compounds, despite Lozzie's protests that this was a friendly place. We stood on a frozen shore opposite moving mountains of black mold, Lozzie singing to them in alien language as they split and recombined, eating and disgorging each other in an endless chain as they flowed downriver, though that river was not water, and the sea which served as their ultimate destination was beyond my imagination. And yet, no matter how beautiful or how awful, every one of these visitations was a kind of subtle, self-inflicted torture. Lozzie could giggle and dance and sing out here, and she did, with relish and relief, even in places I could not comprehend, the ones where I had to close my eyes and press my palms over my ears and wrap myself in my own tentacles, or the ones where I simply had to swallow a scream. Though, to Lozzie's credit, as soon as I did those things she whisked us away to the next whistle-stop location, and her knights guarded me like the loyal hounds they were. But even the beautiful places, the ones that floated in the heart of glowing nebulae, or where the air itself was braided like woven silk, or where all was shimmering dust and bone-white leftovers, even those, I could not fully endure. Every outside dimension we visited felt wrong was wrong. The light was an impossible hue, or the colors shifted along the spectrum just enough to make my vision swim. Or the gravity was incorrect, my own footsteps warped, the processes of my organs confused. My skin tingled, the air a foreign sensation in my lungs. Any surface I touched felt wrong, even through my shoes, and forced nausea down my throat as my body tried to reject the sensation. All outside was formed by the alien rules and logic that ran riot beyond the ordered walls of the castle of earth. My thoughts twisted this way and that under ineffable conditions, held fast only by the inviolable core of abyssal being I had become. We had not evolved for these places. Apes were not meant to be here, outside. Here was soul death amid sublime beauty. No. Lozzie was meant to be out here. I wasn't. Even with what I had become, these places were not meant for me. Enduring them was an act of sheer willpower and self-discipline that I could not keep up for long. Even an abyssal thing is only adjusted for one set of conditions, not all possible climates at once. Lozzie and I huddled inside pink hoodie and pastel poncho amid the black seas of infinity, but she loved it out there. I peered through my fingers at iron blue intensities and void dark infinities. I groped for Lozzie's hand in the middle of whirlstorm winds that pulled not at flesh and bone but at thought and memory. I tucked my tentacles in close to avoid the attention of snuffling intelligences and blind immensities. And by the end of it I felt sick, sick, sick. Do you want to go home? No, I lied. I was an alloy of ape and abyss, testing the limits of my endurance. And I found myself wanting. But it was not merely a matter of physical confrontation. Here was the other half of my childhood and teenage trauma, and I was attacking myself with it, over and over, until I quivered, bleeding, on the edge of my own sanity. It was self-harm, but I did not admit that at the time. Heathy, come, time to come home, come. We're not done. Yes, we are. Lozzie squeezed my hand one last time, skipping back to me in a place where even she did not look remotely human, an inside-out place of coal-black meat and fluttering tissues. No, I have to keep going, have to keep. Lozzie did not take no for an answer. She pulled me home by one hand. We touched back down on the quiet plain of yellow grass, like an antechamber between our reality and the true depths of outside, the continental shelf before the deep dark of open ocean. The first thing I did was sit down very suddenly on the ground, my hand slipping from Lozzie's as my knees gave out. The second thing I did was flinch about a foot in the air at the skull staring up at me from my own lap. I choked out a yelp and flung the twisted thing away in surprise. Oop! Lozzie squeaked as she lunged for it. She caught the skull in both arms before it could hit the ground, tottering on both feet to regain her balance. Heathy. It's not unbreakable, you might crack it. She giggled and shook her head, her voice and face still hidden inside the shadow of her own skull mask. What I don't, I panted for breath, blinking in utter confusion. Lozzie cradled the twisted skull in her arms like a skittish cat. She hopped forward on tiptoes, tilting her upper body to peer down at me, her hair spilling out from her mask in a waterfall of blonde. Heathy. Give me a moment, I managed, trying to gather myself. Confused. I don't. The last hour or 20 minutes, or 3 hours, or 3 days formed a blur of pressurized memory. It was akin to the feeling of coming up for air after being glued to a book. Nothing seemed real, even myself. I grasped my own hands and squeezed to check that I could still feel pain. TCH, ow, I tooted. That was a yes. Lozzie squatted down so she was level with me, then pulled her goat skull mask off and placed it on the ground. Freed from shadow and bone, her face was creased with care and she was biting her lip, big blue eyes like twin sapphires of happy exhaustion after our journey. Her 2 knights, the 2 we'd brought with us on the dizzying trip outside, stepped back from their flanking positions, as if to rejoin the round table spread out across the yellow hillsides. But they did not fully retreat just yet, waiting to be dismissed. Heathy. Lozzie murmured again. I'm okay, I lied. I was very far from okay. I was caked in cold sweat from head to toe, wrapped in my tentacles like an infant sucking her own thumb, and shaking all over. My stomach felt like a black hole and I had a headache, not a brain math headache, for once, but simple dehydration and stress, a constant throb that pounded harder whenever I moved my head. How Lozzie what? We were out there too long for you maybe, she murmured, biting her lip again. Heathy. No, I said. My fault, my request. I managed to blink up at her elfin little face framed by the deep purple night. I think I'm having a panic attack. Or coming down from one. I know. Lozzie squeaked, then reached out her free hand and took mine. She squeezed hard, and I squeezed back, trying to get the weight off my chest. You didn't have to. You didn't have to come if it was going to. I didn't have to, I echoed. I chose to. Bad choice. I forced out an awkward laugh. Aversion therapy, my hat. You don't have a hat, Lozzie murmured and puffed her cheeks out. I almost managed to laugh. Exactly, I croaked. We stayed like that, hand in hand on the yellow hillside, until the shaking and the panting and the worst of the fear passed. I hugged myself with my tentacles and held on tight, forcing out slow breaths, trying to feel normal again. You made it, I told myself. You went outside, for hours or days. How much time had passed? You went out by choice, to some of the most inhuman places you could ever imagine, you endured them, and you came back. You did it. I did not feel proud, I felt damaged. You did it, Lozzie said with a teasing smile through her worry. My little mind reader. I nodded at the skull cradled in the crook of her other arm. Lozzie, what is that? You don't remember? She blinked at me, then held out the alien skull. Here, it's yours. We said we'd get you one as well, remember? I do remember that conversation, yes. The skull in Lozzie's hands, the skull we'd brought back from the night depths, her sisterly offering to me, was a strange and twisted thing, a fluted, metallic gray, bell shape, shaped not unlike how I imagine an octopus skull would look if cephalopods possessed internal skeletons. 6 eye holes stared with blind nothingness behind them, ringed with ridges of protective bone. If the creature had a jaw in life, it did not anymore, only a strange horizontal structure like a slash of mouth, which looked as if it had once been ringed with other appendages or bone supports. The implication made me shudder. I was glad it was dead, and that I was not meeting it face to face in the flesh. The bottom of the skull flared out into a skirt of bone, making it perfect for converting into a mask or helmet. As Lozzie held it out, the skull caught the purplish light of the skies above the quiet plain. The surface shimmered like oil on water, with ripples and rings. The bone was neither clean white nor dirty yellow, but a strangely smooth metallic gray, like a metal that should not have been a solid at normal pressures and temperatures. Where did we? I let my question trail off. We took it from the seabed, 8 or 9 jumps ago, among all the others in the graveyard jumble. You really don't remember? It's super old, from near the bottom where none of the scavengers go because all the flesh has been picked off the bones long ago. And it's beautiful. You said so yourself. Here. She offered it to me again, but I flinched back, 2 tentacles rising as if to defend me from assault. I can't, Lozzie, I really say it's beautiful? You did. I can hold on to it for you if you don't want to take it right now. After all, it's going to need some padding inside for your head and face, and you might need to file down the bits around the eyes because they're still kind of rough despite being in the sea for so long, which is odd, and I think it means it used different kinds of metal to reinforce different parts of itself. Isn't that cool? She beamed at me, more in love with the thing in her hands than I could ever be. But her passion convinced me to try. Gingerly, I reached out with both hands to accept the mortal leavings of a creature I could scarcely imagine. Lozzie beamed even wider, and placed the skull in my hands with all the delicacy of trying to dress a cat. From the metallic appearance I expected the skull to be heavy, but it weighed barely anything at all. Lozzie giggled at my surprise. It's like carbon fiber, I murmured. So light. Probably really strong too. Lozzie chirped. Look, up the top there in the back. She pointed to the underside of the outsider skull. I turned it over gently, as if it was made of spun glass which might break apart in my hands. Lozzie hadn't been exaggerating. On the back of the skull there was a set of faint indentations, tooth marks, sharp and raking, from teeth that had once pierced whatever hide and flesh had clothed this creature. The teeth had been turned away by the diamond-hard surface of the skull. I brushed hesitant fingers over the bite mark. No crack, no weakness, no flaw radiated out from the wound. I wonder if this is what killed it. Don't think so. Lozzie chirped. Too hard for that. Probably one and bit back. I turned the alien cephalopod skull over again, to stare into the eye holes and run my fingers over the contours, though it wasn't strictly a cephalopod. I had learned plenty about that particular biological niche, from months of pining while watching YouTube videos of squid and octopuses. Whatever earthly analog I imagined for this creature, it was not truly of that class. The same as Lozzie's goat skull mask, which had likely not come from a true goat at all. The surface was smooth and cool and somehow soothing, and I felt the sweat finally drying on my skin and sticking my t-shirt to my back. The gentle wind of the quiet plain ruffled my hair. 6 empty eye sockets stared up at me, unseeing and long dead. The metal felt so unfamiliar, but did not make me shudder with disgust. When I tilted the skull, the metal caught the light and showed me a ripple of colors for which I did not have names. Memory dribbled back, of Lozzie and I in a bubble of air on some night sea floor, picking through bones, that had happened, and I had called our find beautiful, if only because it seemed so real down there in the dark. On an impulse I did not understand, I put a finger into one of the eye sockets. What manner of creature had you been? I asked it in the silence of my mind. Mortal, certainly. Mortal enough to die, to leave a body behind, for one like me to find. What kind of thoughts had filled this skull in life? Outside thoughts, alien to me? Or could we have communicated? You weren't like the eye, or the other giants of outside, or the things in the abyss. Were you male or female? Or perhaps you did not have biological sex at all, perhaps you propagated by budding, or cloning, or some other, unthinkable process. What was your identity? Did you have family? None of these questions would ever be answered. But you had flesh, once. I have flesh now, I thought. And one day I will be like you. But not yet. And not outside. I will die old, in bed, I told myself, and I have miles to go before then. It was an oddly comforting idea. My lingering panic attack finally faded away into mere echo. The skull was a connection, a bridge, proof. Heathy. Lozzie's voice crept into my rumination. Thank you for the present, I said. I was right the first time. I think. The first time. It is beautiful. Yay. Lozzie threw her hands in the air, which was not a sustainable pose while also squatting, at least not with her lack of muscle tone. She wobbled and laughed and had to accept falling back onto her bottom with a little poof, legs wiggling in the air. We still do need to talk, I said, feeling oddly emboldened. I had conquered my oldest fear well, with the exception of the eye. What was a chat with Lozzie by comparison? Nothing to be afraid of. Lozzie and I loved each other. Oh. Lozzie sat up from her sprawl, blinking at me. We do. We do. I thought we did. We did. We never finished. Not about the part that really matters, to me. The part that hurt me. Oh. Oops. Lozzie bit her lip. Not oops. It's okay. I sighed. I mean, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm not very good having big serious talks. PFFFFFFT, went Lozzie. You so totally are. Duh. Thank you, I think. In any case, I don't feel like I am. But I'm not going to manipulate you into anything, or browbeat you, or attack you, I promise. I'm not even going to tell you off. Maybe I was going to do that at one point, but it feels silly now. We're friends, and I'm hoping if I express this then you'll understand. Lozzie nodded with enthusiastic urgency, head going up and down like a cartoon donkey, expression that blinking puff-faced seriousness that was impossible not to find sweet, but which meant she really was listening. I found myself winding two of my tentacles around each other, a new nervous behavior. You put me right in front of the eye, without warning, I said. Despite everything, my voice cracked. The memory of burning pressure flared up inside me, of the unstoppable force of the eye's gaze. Lozzie lit up, as much as she could do with her damaged extraocular muscles, and her mouth flew open. But I held a hand out to stop her. I needed her to understand, not just apologize. And I prevailed, I added. I won, I made it out, I learnt I could make it out. I learnt that the eye is not impossible to escape even once it has me in its sight. Which is invaluable. Invaluable. But, Lozzie, you put me there without warning. You made me face I sniffed hard and had to wipe my eyes on the back of my hand. You made me face it. And I need you to understand what that means. Lozzie nodded. Do you understand? I asked. Nod. You can speak now, I said. I didn't mean to silence you, you can. I'm sorry, Lozzie said, and she said it without biting her lip, without upturned eyes, without any cutesy affectation, except her hands gripping the fabric of her poncho. Okay. Okay. I forgive you, I said. I can do that, But it was still the right thing to do, Lozzie continued. Pardon? Now Lozzie bit her lip. She wasn't shaking with fear, but this sudden reversal took courage. You needed me there and you needed me to do that because you just said yourself that it worked out in the end, you needed it. I started to shake my head. Lozzie. I made a decision and it was my decision because you don't have to do everything yourself all the time. You were missing something important and I had to step in because I'm your friend and I get to protect you too. Lozzie raced ahead, voicing her runaway train of thought. What would have happened if I hadn't? You would have killed Badger, or the I would have had him, and you wouldn't have learnt anything at all, and we wouldn't be here talking about this because you might have done something you couldn't take back. And it worked out. She slowed down all of a sudden. And now we're here. I gaped at her. You're trying to justify intentionally exposing me to. No. Lozzie squawked. No, it wasn't justified. Of course it wasn't. Well, we agree on that much. I sighed, shaking my head. Lozzie, it worked out, but it might not have done. There were so many possible things that could have gone wrong, things that could have failed. Because of you deciding something on your own, about me, without asking me. But it was the only thing I could do, she said. So you're saying it wasn't your fault? I asked. Lozzie shook her head, sending faint wisps of blonde hair out from her like a glowing halo. Of course it was my fault because I did it, but if we could rewind time and do it all over again I would still do the same thing, but... Lozzie did something she so rarely could, she stopped. She stopped totally dead, then looked up and away from me, at the spirals of purple light in the unnatural night sky. But I would ask you first. Okay. Okay. Okie dokie deuce. I would have to ask you first. I wish I could time travel, it's so much easier that way. She looked back at me with an expression like a goblin caught with her hand in a biscuit tin. And I won't do it again. I won't. I'm sorry. She held a hand out toward me. Hesitant at first, I accepted her hand, small and cool and soft in my own. I sighed and tried to share a smile with her too. Don't hate me, she added in a small voice. I don't, I sighed. Apology accepted. Even if we don't agree, it matters that you understand. I'm smarter than I look. She chirped, then let go of my hand with a giggle. You really seriously for real thought I wouldn't? I shrugged, a touch of color creeping into my cheeks. I cleared my throat, feeling horribly awkward. My turn to apologize, I suppose. Lozzie, with the way you act back in reality, sometimes it's difficult to keep in mind you're not actually a 13-year-old or something. Lozzie mock gaped at me, scandalized and outraged, but she wasn't a good enough actor to sell the drama. I still rolled my eyes and had to look away, half in embarrassment, half in guilt. We've talked about plenty of non-childish things, she chirped. All sorts. You'd never talk to Tenny about half of what we've talked about, and especially in the dreams, but no you don't remember that all properly, right? Yes, okay. Do you remember telling me about how Rain figured she can make you pop twice in a row if she... Lozzie. I squeaked, my outrage quite real. Lozzie burst into a peal of giggles. I glanced at the knights a few paces away, as if they gave a hoot about overhearing the details of my sex life. They don't think about those sorts of things. Lozzie announced after following the direction of my flustered gaze. Yes, but it's still a bit weird to have it said out loud. You didn't care about that in the dreams. Just relax, Heathy. You know you can talk to me about anything at all, I don't judge, what have I got to judge on anyway? You know all the things about me and I know all the things about you. I let out a little sigh, almost sad. I don't, actually. Know all the things about you, I mean. Because the dreams are still hazy. PBBBBBT, Lozzie made a sad sound and flopped sideways on the pale yellow grass. That's true, but it doesn't have to be true. New promise. We'll do a new promise. There was an old promise? I asked, somewhat liking this notion. Many, Lozzie chanted from the ground. But new promise now. I promise not to make decisions that affect you without asking you first, including, she stuck out a finger. Including more dreams. I would love to dream with you again, I blurted out. But I'd like to remember them this time. And in return, you promise to ask me things if you want to know them. Agreed, I said, easily and softly. Do we need to do a ritual to seal the promise? Lozzie wrinkled her nose, which looked extra silly with her face sideways. Promises are promises, the words make them happen and not when you rub your blood together or something. If it's a true promise then you know because it gets kept and if it was false then it doesn't. I felt unaccountably playful when I asked, and which is this? Lozzie grinned wide, impish and teasing. A true one. All right. All right. I felt a mischievous flutter. Lozzie, do you fancy twill? Wah-wah-awaya. Lozzie burst into laughter, kicking her legs and smacking the ground with both hands before flailing herself back up into a sitting position. I was blushing enough for both of us, mortified at my own question. Fuzzy. No. No, no, no way. Not mine, not my type. Typing. Style. I don't know if I will ever have a type but fuzzy is fuzzy and not like that. A very comprehensive answer, I hurried to say, trying to manually rub the blush off my own cheeks. Yes. Thank you. Okay. Ahem. I actually said ahem out loud. I could be such a gossip, but I couldn't take the heat. Lozzie giggled at my self-inflicted discomfort and then shuffled to cross the gap between us. She settled in beside me and propped her chin on my shoulder, so we could both look down at the metallic skull in my lap. She reached down to stroke the strange outsider's skull. I think it's really pretty, she said. It is, in its own way. It'll make a good mask. And why would I need a mask? I asked. Lozzie shrugged and puffed her cheeks out. Maybe it's not a mask then, she said. I sighed and leaned my head against hers, thought to thought. I wish you'd told me in the first place, I said, about Badger coming to apologize to you. We could have approached everything differently, at least. But then you might not have been able to do it, which is fair because it was a hard thing to do and hard things are hard. Still. I pulled back so I could look her in the eyes. I wish you'd just told me that you had a problem with his death. I always assumed well. I saw you stab a man to death with a scalpel once, you were wild, you were what's-o. As I said those words as I recalled what Lozzie had done back when I'd murdered her brother, recalled her palming a scalpel and slitting the throat of one of her brother's cultist minions. Lozzie squeezed her eyes shut and shook her head, jerky and cringing and blocking it out, shrinking down inside herself to hide from the memory. Oh, I repeated, and realized what I'd been missing this entire time. Oh, Lozzie, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. It's okay, it's okay, it's okay, it's okay, she hissed to herself, then opened her eyes again, panting softly and trying to smile. I'm okay, just don't. Okay, okay. I won't bring it up, not now, not now. Lozzie clung to me, squeezing my hoodie into tight handfuls in both her fists, shivering and shaking inside her own skin. I held her gently, stroking the back of her head, trying to tease her hair into a semblance of order. After a while she stopped shaking quite so badly, and slowly, ever so slowly, to give us something to focus on, I set about the intimate process of braiding her hair. None of us, not me, not Evie, not Rain, not Cheng, to my knowledge had ever addressed the fact that Lozzie had committed murder to escape her abusive brother. I'd blasted Alexander Lilburn into a broken mess of pulped meat and shattered bone, yes, and that had changed me forever. Over time I had discovered, to my twinned horror and fascination, that perhaps I was built for this after all. Not like Rain, but enough not to be destroyed by the act. Lozzie was not built for murder. Lozzie didn't even like to hear talk of violence. And she'd stabbed a man in the throat because that was her only option. I'd gotten so used to thinking of her escape as a rescue, but she had participated along with us. She'd been mentally unwell back then, unwell because of abuse, but that did not make her immune to what she'd had to do. We sat huddled together on that quiet plain, allowing the minutes to stretch out beneath the soft purple light as I braided Lozzie's hair and one of my tentacles slipped around her waist in a hug. Gentle wind teased stray strands of blonde out of my hands, which I dutifully gathered back in. The fairy tale knights of her round table kept their own counsel. She did not want to talk about this right now, so I kept my mouth shut, because I'd already done enough damage. I finished braiding her hair and held up the unsecured end. "Pretty," Lozzie chirped. The bounce was back in her voice, even if weak. I thanked whatever gods would listen. "We don't have anything to tie it with, though," I said. Lozzie rummaged beneath her poncho. I'd always suspected she had secret pockets sewn into the lining, and my suspicions were heightened when she lit up with an "aha," and wriggled an arm out to present me with a little pink hair tie. I bound up the end of her braid, nice and neat. "Thank ye," she purred, and we shared a hug. "Lozzie, if you ever want to." "I will," she chirped before I could finish. "But not now," I finished for her, nodding. "Not now. It's okay." A herky-jerky smile twitched back onto Lozzie's lips. She twisted around, bounced to her feet, and offered me a hand. I accepted, hugging the outsider cephalopod skull to my chest with the other hand as Lozzie helped me up. She retrieved her goat skull mask from the ground too. "Time to go home and have dinner?" I asked. "I need to decompress," she said, smile teasing, eyelashes fluttering. "You said not to take you to extreme places outside, but there's places I haven't seen in months and months and I want to go see them. I can go by myself." My heart dropped into my stomach, but I tried not to let it show on my face. I failed miserably. "All right," I said. "Oh, Heathy, I'm not going anywhere." She threw her arms around my neck and squeezed me quickly. "I'll be back soon enough, I promise." "How soon?" I croaked out, my throat closing up. Lozzie danced back a couple of paces, closed one eye, then the other, then opened both. "I dunno. The morning? Like I'm going out for a night." "You don't do that, but it's a thing that people do a lot and I want to." "PLE. You don't have to ask for my permission," I blurted out. "I'm not keeping you from going out and partying." "Oh my goodness." I rolled my eyes and felt absolutely absurd. "I'm like a droll, stick-in-the-mud older sister, aren't I?" I hiccuped, because otherwise I might cry again. "Keeping you from going out and having fun. Not droll." Lozzie directed a serious little frown at me. "Indoor fun is fun too. But sometimes you need to see your other friends. Your outside friends." "Right." Lozzie nodded up and down, her braid bouncing. I need you with me, Lozzie," I said. "For Maisie, and for." "I am with you," she declared, pointing one finger at me. "And I'll be back for breakfast. Smoke me a kipper." I frowned and spluttered out a laugh. "A what?" "A kipper. You know." "Actually, I don't know what a kipper is. I think it's a fish, but I just heard it somewhere, so cereal is fine." "I'll find out what a kipper is and smoke you one," I laughed, trying to hold back everything else I felt. Lozzie was just going out for the evening. Outside. To all those nightmare vistas and impossible places, because that was her natural environment. What shall I say to Tenny? Mummy's out for the evening. She'll understand. I've told her all about outside, she knows what it means. Do you maybe want to take her along sometime? What was I even saying? Trying to make this seem normal, make it less terrifying. Lozzie's good humor hit a speed bump. She sighed and flapped her poncho. Tenny's not a child of outside. Oh. She was made on Earth. With all Earth parts and Earth thoughts and stuff. There's places I really want to show her, but she's not built for it like we are. Like you are, I thought, but did not say out loud. Well, that's fair enough, I said. She's going to need room to fly, eventually. And she will get it. Lozzie spread her arms to indicate the quiet plane, goat skull mask dangling from one hand. Ah. Yes. Anyway. Heathie, you can see yourself home, yeah. I'll be back in the morning, for real, I promise. I managed a nod. My throat was dry, my palms clammy, but I did not reach out for Lozzie. I chose to trust her. She slipped the goat skull mask back over her head, transforming into a pixie from the underworld once more, then skipped across the few feet which separated us and hugged me once more, squeezed me hard until I choked out a laugh and squeezed her back. Then she let go, our hands touching at the fingertips as she stepped away. "Laters," she chirped, so undeniably happy. And then with a hop and a skip, she ran and leaped into the air. And vanished. I stood there for several long minutes of silence and peace on the quiet plain, trying to fight down a lump in my throat, twisting my hoodie in one hand and hugging myself with my tentacles. I did trust Lozzie. She wasn't Maisie, she wasn't being kidnapped or taken away, she was my friend and she was going out for the night, to places that she'd been to many, many times before. A night on the town, I said out loud, and laughed a sad laugh at myself, then let out a big sigh. "Heather, you're so silly. She'll be fine." I bid a goodbye only for now to the knights, though none of them responded in any visible fashion. I even patted one of them, the one who had opened its armor to me. I located Evelyn's blue bucket a few feet away, picked it up, and tucked the outsider cephalopod skull under my arm. Then I took some deep breaths, closed my eyes, and executed the familiar old equation. Time to go back to where I belonged. Time to cry into Rain's shoulder and endure a sleepless night waiting for Lozzie to come home. Out. Space folded up around me. And bony hands closed around my ankles in a vice grip of iron and ice, to hold me fast before I could cross back to reality. Cold as an empty grave and strong as granite, dead hands closed around the delicate bones of my ankles until talus and tibia creaked under pressure. I was held fast, neither in reality nor outside, neither back home in Sherrowford nor stranded on the quiet plain. I wanted to scream, but could not. I wanted to thrash and kick and spit, but could not. I wanted to reach down with tentacle and claw and extrude specialized cutting tools and rip the hands off at their own wrists, but could not. Could not do. Could not act. Could not even think. I was stuck neither here nor there, but nowhere at all. Inside the membrane, in the transitional state, caught in the act of translocation. It was both a single moment and also eternity, because time did not mean anything in the between space. This was not the abyss. If the dead hands had dragged me down there, I could have turned on them like a cornered fox and torn them apart with beautiful truth. But this was merely the cell wall, the space between one state and the other, the phase transition. In itself it meant nothing, was nothing, could produce and harbor and be nothing. I was stuck there, and yet I did not exist there. It was like being suffocated. And then I rubber-banded back out, because vacuum abhors presence. I crashed back outside squealing and spluttering like a dying pig. The soft yellow grass of the quiet plain rushed up to meet me as my knees gave out. I dropped the blue plastic bucket and the beautiful outsider cephalopod skull, gripped by full-body rejection of what I'd just experienced. Shivering as if in the claws of a fever, I managed to stay on my hands and knees, sagging and moaning, body drenched from head to toe in cold sweat. My vision throbbed black and red, head pounding like a struck gong. My 6 tentacles braced against the ground as well, and I would have collapsed without their support, though I lost control of my stomach. I vomited in a kind of way I hadn't for months. Disgust and panic and physical revulsion brought up bile and acid laced with a surprising amount of blood. For a long time, several minutes, not the mere subjective time torture of fear and pain, all I could do was stare at the puddle of my own sick and force wheezing breaths into my fluttering lungs, arms and legs quivering as if I'd run for miles. My head span, my vision was blurry. The crude chemical factory of my poor, abused ape body needed time to adjust to the shock. Eventually I summoned the presence of mind to feed that chemical factory. I slid another control rod a quarter out of the bioreactor in my abdomen, flushing my body with energy. But no equilibrium came. Blood-tainted sweat dripped from my nose. What on earth? But I wasn't on earth. The word stuck in my throat. Ignore it. Ignore it, Heather, I hissed to myself, then choked, almost vomiting again. You have to ignore it. Don't think, don't think, don't think. Can't stay like this. Can't. Come on, get up, get up. Rain's waiting for you, get up. That got me moving, though only enough to crawl clear of the vomit puddle and flop onto my back on the yellow grass. Panting, dazed, trying to fight down the mounting horror, I stared up at the whirled purple sky of this outside place. The shaking intensified, spreading to my whole body. I wrung my hands together, trying to quite literally get a grip on myself. My tentacles tried to help, wrapping around my waist and chest in a self-administered emergency hug. Couldn't think about what this meant, couldn't allow that thought to grow. I'd lose control, I'd break down and curl into a ball and never move again. Instead I sat up, clutching my own ankles to protect them. Coward, I hissed, then hiccuped, then tried again. The familiar old equation slid down like rose-tinted poison. I span it up at the speed of thought, this time I was ready, tentacles poised, with the toxic knowledge of a dozen other equations waiting at my back, ready to skin and deb one and melt and crack. Out. Dead hands closed a cold vice around my ankles, right on cue. I reached toward them with pneumosomatic limb and hyperdimensional mathematics, with all the warning coloration of imminent conflict and the black flags of no mercy and the bleeding eyes of cornered animal savagery. Like before, they should retreat in fear. A coward's filthy trick is one thing, but fighting on this kind of level is another, and over the last few months I had received what Rain might call a battlefield baptism in supernatural struggle. Whatever the hands were, they were not up to a fight, they'd proved that before, they'd run, they'd vanished, they'd declined the duel. This time, the hands did not flee. I touched the dead hands, made contact with cold, dry, papery flesh, made ready to rip and tear and break and shred, readying all the tools at the bottom of my subconscious. If they would not yield, I would even drag them down into the abyss. Hands, hands, I kept thinking of them as hands, but there was no visual information here in the stop time of hyperdimensional mathematics, no sensory input that was not the desperate interpretation of electrically charged meat, no instinct that was not misapplied savanna ape evolution. I made contact and the hands exploded outward into 100 iterations of themselves. Fractal expansion of dead flesh and clawing fingers grasped at my own specialized tools, wrapped my blades in bony fingers, dug iron-hard digits into my tentacles, hands, 100, then 1,000, flowing over each other like something from one of Rain's terrible zombie movies she tried to show me, a tidal wave of grasping, holding, grabbing and gripping, the very concept of possessing, boiled down to what one may hold tight in one's own clenched fist. For every finger I ripped off another 3 appeared from the torn stump, for every wrist I shattered, another 2 sprouted in its place, for every grip I broke by peeling muscle from bone, another dozen latched on. If this had happened in reality I would have been screaming my head off, instead, my instinctive reaction screamed dive. Down into the abyss, where this thing would not survive. I would drown it. But I couldn't go. I couldn't leap deeper. The dead hands held me back, like slamming myself against the bonds of a net. To struggle was pointless, like fighting mold that grew faster than I could tear at it. Somehow I knew that the hands could have flowed up and over my face and head if they so chose, that my act of keeping them at bay was futile. I gave up and crashed back to my own body, groaning and crying and doubling up to vomit again, stomach muscles clenching on nothing but stringy bile. My vision swam and my nose ran freely with blood, dripping down my chin and onto the yellow grass. Wheezing for breath, headache pounding, I dug my fingers into the dry soil as if I could somehow dig my way back to reality. No, I began to whine through clenched teeth, and wished I hadn't. All my worst fears were coming true. I tried to look up at the yellow horizon, but it was blurred through a veil of tears. I started to hyperventilate, a weight pressing on my chest. No amount of bioreactor energy or bodily euphoria could hold this back. Lozzie, I whispered. Lozzie, come back, Rain. Evie. Zheng. Maisie. The panic attack rolled over me like a breaking storm. Hands shaking, caked in sweat, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps, my heart raced and wouldn't stop, my chest felt like it was collapsing. I couldn't do anything but curl up where I sat in sheer unbridled terror. Hiccups interrupted wet, choking sobs. Everything had been so good only minutes before, everything had been okay, but now the walls had closed in. Outside was never my worst nightmare, getting stuck there was. I don't know how long I sat, crying and shaking, hugging myself with my tentacles. 10, 20, 30 minutes, shivering and growing cold. I was completely alone. Nobody was coming for me. Not Rain, not Zheng, not any of my friends and comrades and would-be saviors, because I was beyond anybody's reach out there. Anybody but Lozzie, and she had left with a hop and a skip and a smile on her face. I had come so far since I'd been a terrified half-alive thing, rotting in my own delusion and exhaustion in the days before Rain had found me. I was armed with hyperdimensional mathematics, a bioreactor in my guts, a living shadow of my abyssal self in summoned tentacles and limitless potential. I was observer and observed, I was the adopted daughter of the eye, and my shoulders were still wrapped with the yellow cloak from 7 shades of sunlight. But in the end I was still without Maisie. I was incomplete. A half-person, a joke. And I was alone, trapped outside. I can't, I whispered to myself, throat thick and clogged. Can't. A shining hand descended into my field of vision, I didn't have the energy to flinch. I looked up and found one of Lozzie's knights before me, blurred by tears, half knelt to offer me a gauntlet hand. I hadn't even heard the knight approach. I stared at it for a long moment as my brain caught up. Not alone. The panic attack had technically passed, leaving despair and childhood fear in its wake, but all of a sudden I felt like I was waking up from a nightmare. My clothes were stuck to my skin with cold sweat, and I felt terribly weak, but I took a deep, cleansing breath and then accepted the knight's hand. My own was very small in comparison to the gauntlet of outsider starsteel, but the metal felt faintly warm as if heated by gentle sunlight. The knight straightened up and easily helped me to my feet. "Thank you," I croaked, then cleared my throat. The knight didn't respond, just stood as if waiting for orders. I scrubbed my eyes clear and wiped my bloody nose on my sleeve, but most of the blood had dried. Then I flapped my hoodie and t-shirt, trying to alleviate the physical discomfort of sticky sweat as best I could. I gave myself the time I needed to think. I was experiencing something I never had before. Panic had actually burnt itself out. Without an immediate threat, and having passed through the crucible of a panic attack, my mind was well, not clear, not this deep in ancient trauma. But close enough. I knew I had to get out of here, one way or another. I was lost, but not permanently. Not yet. I could hug you, you know that. I told the knight, though I didn't expect a response. I awkwardly patted its metal arm. The knight who had helped me up was not one of the two that had guarded Lozzie and I during our outside pub crawl. This knight did not carry shield and lance like the majority of Lozzie's knightly order, but held a gigantic single-bladed axe slung over one shoulder, the sort of axe one might use to fight dragons or ogres in a traditional fairy tale. Its armor was accented with little swirls and lines etched into the metal, not unlike floral patterns. When I squinted and peered closer, the decoration revealed itself as abstract representation, an optical illusion which brought to mind the depths of a forest seen from the edge of the tree line, filled with secret green places and dripping branches. It didn't seem like something Lozzie would make. Was this the knight's own choice? "So, which member of the round table are you meant to be?" I asked it. The knight continued staring down at me with that blank-faced helmet, though I knew the hollow inside the helm contained only the end of an anchor tentacle. I found myself addressing its midsection instead, where I knew the true creature must reside, tucked away in metal and darkness. Oh, I am sorry, I breathed, forcing the absurd words as a ritual of calming, trying to think about anything except what was happening to me. You are a true knight, you're not meant to be anything. My apologies. The knight dipped its chin in thanks. That was all. I took a deep breath to further fortify myself and then looked away, first out at the horizon. One of Lozzie's gigantic caterpillar creatures was still inching along the grassy plains. Its course must have curved closer to us, because it seemed slightly bigger than before, the vertical ribs more easily defined against the off-white of the creature's massive carapace. I could see little antennas which must actually have been as tall as a person sticking up from the front of the caterpillar in a cluster of sensory organs or equipment. Then I looked up into the calming beauty of the whirled and spiraled sky, then finally down at the ground. Oh, oops, I said to myself, and left the knight's side to retrieve the cephalopod skull I'd dropped. I cradled it in my arms and hugged it to my belly. I would have preferred a pillow, or a friend, but this cold comfort would have to serve. I looked at the ground again and frowned. It's you, isn't it? I asked. Then, feeling terribly awkward, I cleared my throat and glanced up at the forest pattern knight. Not you, sorry, I told it. I was talking to I gestured at the ground. Silly really, the physical ground was not actually where the dead hands had come from. But the knight didn't respond. I think it understood my intent. I turned back to the ground, talking to nothing. It's you, correct? I can't think of anybody else who would be stuck between our reality and outside, disembodied, trying to trap me. You used Lozzie's needs as bait, didn't you? You let us come outside, because she was never your real target. I'm your target. You hate me because I murdered you. The ground did not answer. Neither did the sky. I sighed and felt absurd, but I kept going. I killed you once, Alexander, I said, then sighed, blushing even though I was the only one who cared. And yes, I know it sounds like rain, it's like a one-liner she'd say trying to be cool. But it's true, I will kill you again if I have to. Whatever you are now, you are not beyond my reach. Gentle wind, sweet-smelling and faintly warm. The feel of my own heartbeat, exhausted by adrenaline. One of my own tentacles squeezing my waist. No reply. I let out a final sigh of surrender. Oh well. Maybe it's not even him at all. Maybe it's something else, completely different. What do you think? I glanced up at the knight, but it declined to offer an opinion. Yes, my thoughts exactly. Okay, next is step 2, let's see if she's about. I looked up and around and raised my voice. I didn't need to, but it felt right. Sevens. I called out. My voice echoed away across the quiet plain and died off on the wind. Sevens, if you're here, if you're paying attention, I could really use some help right now. Practical help, you understand? I'm stranded. I'm in very big trouble. Are you here? Silence and wind and the nights beneath purple light, but no flicker of sun-kissed gold. If Sevens was listening, she wasn't willing to step onto the stage. Perhaps subconsciously, I tried to tug at the feeling of her yellow cloak which still hung about my shoulders, invisible and intangible. I hadn't seen her since she'd gifted me this part of herself. Not even a glimpse. I didn't know what that meant and I couldn't help but worry about her. She's a godlike outsider creature, Heather, I tutted to myself. I'm sure she's fine. You need to concentrate. I had to stay logical, had to take practical steps, practical problem-solving steps. I didn't want to do this, but there was only one logical thing to try next. I glanced up at the axe-carrying knight. Do you know how to locate Lozzie? I asked. I looked back past its elbow, at all the other knights, sitting or standing, frozen in their poses of thought. Do any of you know? None of them responded. All right. I'll take that as a no. Will you consent to come with me, elsewhere? I asked the forest-etched knight. I need to experiment, but I don't want to go alone. I can bring you right back, or at least back to the house, if this works. I promise I won't abandon you anywhere. The knight did not need to nod, it simply raised a single gauntlet and laid it upon my shoulder. Ah! I forced myself to breathe out as butterflies started up in my stomach. I was really going to do this. I see. You understand what I'm talking about then. Awkwardly, I laid my own hand over the warm metal gauntlet and added a tentacle just to be sure. Hold on tight, please. I'm not as good at this as Lozzie is. It held on tight. I span up the equation at the speed of thought and added a slice of the say map, the map of all realities, to select an outside dimension as non-threatening as possible. Out. The quiet plane collapsed in a spinning kaleidoscope. My experiment was not only a miserable failure, it also hurt, a lot. It left me exhausted, even with the limitless energy of my bioreactor thrumming away in the wet red darkness inside my abdomen. Dead hands Alexander Lilban or not did not try to stop me jumping from the quiet plane to another outside dimension. Or perhaps they couldn't. The knight and I materialized in the snowbound castle that Lozzie had taken me to twice before, in a sort of long gallery open to the elements along one side, affording me a breathtaking view of the deep valley in which the castle sat, filled with gnarled trees and thickly swirling snowflakes beyond the monolithic blocks of stone. The axe knight caught me around the belly before I could fall over and vomit my guts out, helping me to retain my feet as my tentacles flailed for purchase and my stomach clenched up hard. My teeth began to chatter within seconds of our arrival. The cold here was like a physical wall. The small signal fires burning at regular intervals along the open gallery did not provide much heat, so I clung to the knight's front to leech the warmth of its armor. "Thank you," I croaked. Onward and out. Out, again, to see if the hands could follow me here, if they still barred my way back home when my exit point was a different outside dimension entirely. They had. I found the hands waiting for me at the membrane yet again, like a clever guard dog that had circled around inside a curtain wall. Reeling, coughing, choking, the knight and I both got rubber-banded back to the snowbound castle together, like a toy boat filled with air exploding from the surface of the bathwater. Simple physics, applied on the scale of universal principle. The knight wasn't shocked, but it did stagger, clank-clank with those imperishable metal boots against the cold stone of the castle floor. I hung limp in the poor thing's grip, vomiting and spluttering and heaving for breath with the strain of a third casting out. It was a small miracle I didn't drop the cephalopod skull again, hugged tight in my tentacles. Didn't work, I panted against the metal of the knight's chest. Okay, have to go back, have to. Go back, think. Familiar old equation like a progressively blunted sword, but it could still tear the gossamer between worlds. Back in the relative warmth of the quiet plain once more, I slumped from the forest knight's grip, still shivering from the lingering cold. Curling my freezing toes inside my trainers, I hugged myself and rubbed my arms, even as my head throbbed with pain and I fought off the after effects of another intentional slip and another shove back by the dead hands. Well, here we are again, I said through chattering teeth. I couldn't keep doing this. The forest knight resumed a pose of relaxed indifference, axe over one shoulder. I sat down heavily on the grass with the squid skull in my lap, allowing the bioreactor to flood me with slow waves of heat to fight back the cold, with my tentacles acting as insulation. Eventually I stopped shivering, but by then my thoughts were closing in again. I'm not alone, I whispered, then cleared my throat and raised my voice, trying to make myself sound confident. Who was I kidding? I was talking to myself. In the worst-case scenario, I said out loud, I just have to wait for Lozzie. Until tomorrow morning. She'll go home, back to the house, and then she'll know I got stuck. Unless the hands try to stop her too. No, don't think that, you can't think that, you can't. She'll go home and Evelyn will have to reactivate the gateway, pointed here, and oh God. Oh, Rain. She's going to be worried sick. Understatement of the year. Rain was likely going out of her mind with worry, she couldn't help, didn't know where I was. All her daring and confidence did not apply to this problem. For all I knew, Evelyn was already trying to rework the gateway mandala. After all, I'd been gone quite a while. But without Lozzie's innate knowledge she wouldn't or couldn't deduce how to adjust the gateway to connect to this plane of outside. If Lozzie is stuck too, or, I put the idea together slowly, a lump growing in my throat. If nobody else can get to me, I'll have to fight the hands. I should be able to fight the hands. Damn it, I hissed, I stared down the eye, why couldn't I fight them off? Because they were infinitely expanding, a fractal explosion. And there's only one of me. Only 6 tentacles, I sighed, answering my own question. I glanced over the night spread out across the hillsides, there was an idea. But no, however skilled they might be at physical combat, this was hyperdimensional mathematics, or perhaps just plain old magic. Lozzie, I murmured, please just come back. Just come back. We can beat it together. Surely. My breath caught on the lump in my throat. I was out of options, out of places to turn. Not alone, but without the kind of help I needed. If only Evelyn were here, she would know something we could try, some spell or old book to bridge the gap, or if only Sevens was listening, ready to step in, or even if Zheng was by my side. She might not be able to help, but she'd put up a good fight all the same. I needed a mage. I lit up inside and actually gasped out loud, a true eureka moment. There was one mage I could reach, in theory. Oh please, please be where we last saw you, please, I said through shaking lips, climbing to my feet and grabbing the cephalopod skull again. I turned to the night. We've got to go somewhere really dangerous. Well, okay, no, I have to go somewhere really dangerous, even for me. Are you willing to? The Axe Knight placed a metal hand on my shoulder and tilted its helmet. Thank you, I whispered, then swallowed and found my mouth had gone very dry indeed. This is going to be difficult, I have to get the exact location we left from. I might be bleeding on the other side, unconscious, dazed, worse, I don't know. Please catch me. And right, yes. No time to waste. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and jammed both hands into the black swamp at the bottom of my soul. This operation required not only the familiar old equation to force passage through the membrane between worlds, targeted via the indelible memory of the same app, but needed me to perform exact translocation with only meters of allowable error. I had to take us to the right spot, a place I'd known only at the height of stress and panic, a place with no real landmarks I could think of, no distinguishing features, just memory and mathematical data. The effort to attain that level of precision might fry my brain. But I did have the emotions. One of the most important moments of my life had happened there, the moment I pulled a beloved friend back from the brink. Could emotion be processed into mathematical input? How bleak, how cold. I hated the notion, but it was the truth. Just because we're all mathematics and brain chemistry in the end does not make our experiences any less valuable. I built an equation at the speed of thought, piece by exact piece, through the all-too-familiar construct of the intentional slip and the sickening, impossible directions of the map, then onward into my own memories of cradling Evelyn's bruised and battered self-worth. I rendered experience down into the raw materials of hyperdimensional mathematics, until I knew the exact spot where it had happened. Out. My head flared with blinding pain. I was out cold before reality folded up. The scent of books and dust and aged wood teased me back to consciousness. Those old friends let me know I'd gotten the destination at least half correct. I groaned and opened blood-gummed eyes and found myself curled into a ball on my side, cold drool pooling on the floorboards next to my slack lips. Bookcases towered in front of me, marching off into the distance, stuffed to overflowing with all manner of volumes in all shapes and sizes, scrolls and leather-bound tomes and things that didn't seem like books at all, with leaves of metal or ridged spheres with hexagonal openings. Down a row of bookcases I spied grey robes fluttering past, dragged by the shuffling stride of leathery gray feet, on the eternal task of cataloging and sorting. A pair of chrome boots stood off to one side of my peripheral vision the night, unmoving, facing outward, guarding my unconscious body. I looked up at the helmet and the axe. The night seemed untouched. I breathed a tiny sigh of relief. How long have I been lying here? I croaked, coughing. My throat was dry, my head thick with sleep, my muscles stiff. The night did not answer. Neither did the jumbled deeps of the library of Carcosa. When I tried to sit up, I discovered that I'd wrapped myself in my tentacles, like a cat nuzzling into its own tail, or an armadillo or pangolin tucking itself tight within layers of armored scales. Disentangling myself was like stretching sleep-addled limbs, coupled with the slow-to-wake feeling of the thrumming reactor warming up in my belly. I felt stupid and guilty and disoriented. Oversleeping outside, how absurd. I also found the cephalopod skull hugged tight to my stomach, safely brought with us during the transition. Didn't want to lose Lozzie's gift. Eventually I got myself into a sitting position and then clambered to my feet, using the Forest Knight's chrome elbow for support that I didn't really need. Rubbing the crusted blood out of my eyes and filling my lungs served to sharpen my senses, but looking around us granted no sense of recognition, no relief. Well, I said to the night, to myself, to nobody. We made it, but I don't know if this is the right spot. The library of Carcosa swallowed the sound of my voice, the quiet itself like a thick, cloying blanket around my head and face. We had made it to the library, of that there could be no doubt. I'd managed to deposit the night and myself on a broad concourse of open floorboards which ran parallel to the vast canyon between the two walls of library floors. The dizzying open space yawned wide to our left, separated from us by a mere waist-high banister. The gap was crisscrossed with spindly walkways and creaking bridges. A touch of vertigo made my head swim when I dared glance down at the canyon floor far below, with its drifts and mounds of discarded books. The far wall tempted me to look up at the infinite height, worryingly familiar now, how upsetting, how strange, that an outside place could seem familiar. To our right lay the depths of this library floor, rows of bookcases that appeared ordered from the edge, but revealed their bedlam and chaos if you dared peer around a corner. Little stacks of books like balanced rocks lay between the avalanches of dislodged texts. A few squid-faced librarians went about their business in ones and twos, but none of them close to us. Had the imposing presence of Lozzie's night kept them away? I swallowed and blinked and tried to remember, was this the place that Evelyn had almost been taken away by the library's catalog system? I glanced up and down the open space between the library stacks and the canyon edge, but there was no sign of my quarry. If we were in the right place, then all trace of that event had been cleared away. No bizarre macrophage creature down in the canyon below, no scrum of librarians. And no gray sphere machine. No soldies. Every part of this library looks the same as all the other parts, I hissed, frustration and fear rising in my throat like acid reflux. Oh, what was I thinking? Even if this is the same spot, she would have moved on by now. Why would she stay? My shot in the dark had gone wide, my slim hope turning to ash in my hands. My tentacles were restless, curling about the knight's arm and reaching out to poke at loose books on the nearest shelf, nervous actions to occupy my overtaxed mind. A lump was growing in my throat again, fear returning in clear-headed logic fading fast. Locating soldies in all the unknown vastness of the library of Carcosa was almost as daunting as trying to find Lozzie among the infinite alien spheres of outside. But she is here, I said. We know she's here. That means. I trailed off as my eyes wandered down the length of the library floor to the nearest squid-faced librarian, currently occupied in a strange reshelving process with a fallen pile of books. It looked like the work of several days to come. The creature wasn't going anywhere soon. That one. I glanced up at the Axe Knight's helmet. Will you follow me? I'll do my best to protect you out here, but I can't do this alone. If I get overwhelmed, The knight answered me with a disarmingly human response. I was starting to think of it as rolled one shoulder as if limbering up, and adjusted his grip on the massive axe. Right. Thank you, I said, nodding pointlessly. I'll have to lead the way. We don't have Evelyn's scouting tools, no nuts and bolts to throw ahead of us, so I've got the longest reach. We're only going 50 feet or so. Step where I step. The journey to the squid-faced librarian only took a couple of minutes, but it felt like hours. I inched along, watching for distortions in the air, for discolored patches of floorboard, or any other telltale sign of the anomalies we had previously encountered in the library. Last time we'd had Evelyn's bag of cloth-wrapped nuts to throw ahead to test our path, but now I simply stretched out a tentacle, feeling the way ahead, trying to still my racing heart with the knowledge that I could regrow the pneumosomatic flesh if I really had to. The knight followed behind me on surprisingly silent feet, sticking close. I stopped about 6 feet from the squid-faced librarian creature. If we had left any ill will or hard feelings behind when we had departed last time, it didn't show any. It stayed focused on its task, bending at the waist to pick up books from the fallen pile, feeding each one into its own head like a library return slot made of sharp spines and writhing gray tentacles. A few seconds passed after it ate each book, and then its ragged gray robes would twitch with horrible sinuousness, prompting the creature to reach inside the robes and withdraw a book, sometimes the same one, sometimes totally different, before finally slotting the book into the proper place on the shelves. Hello, I raised my voice into a stage whisper, then rolled my eyes at myself. Now was not the time to stand on library etiquette. Nobody was going to tut and frown at me if I spoke up and made some noise. Well, I certainly hoped they wouldn't. I wouldn't want to meet whoever was in charge here. Excuse me, I tried again. Hello. Hi. Hello. I need, assistance. I think that's what you do. Sometimes. The librarian carried on working. I frowned and was about to huff and turn to the knight at my back, but then Lozzie's own technique surfaced from my memory. I could have kissed her for that. With one tentacle after all, I didn't want to risk brushing the creature with my bare skin. I picked up a single book from the low drift of fallen tomes and held it out to the squid-faced librarian. At first it ignored my offering, but when it finished processing the current book it was on, it didn't bend down to retrieve another volume. It turned to me instead. Here. For you, I said, feeling terribly awkward. Between the forest knight and the librarians, I was practically a chatterbox by comparison. Please take it, and please listen to my request. The squid-faced librarian accepted the book in its gnarled gray hands and promptly fed it into its own face, engulfing the book within a second or two. Then it waited, facing me. I felt the most sudden and unaccountable urge to take the outsider cephalopod skull and place it over my head and face, to hide my true identity in front of this tiny, detached appendage of whatever intelligence truly managed the library. With fumbling hands I did exactly that, despite the lack of padding or cushioning for my head. I lowered the mask over my own face. The metallic skull was a little large for the task, and ridges inside dug into my scalp, but it weighed barely anything and the eye sockets lined up perfectly with my own eyes. The sound of my own breathing echoed in my ears, but I felt safe and secure. Shielded. Saldies, I said out loud. The mask didn't muffle my voice as much as I'd worried. Saldies. The mage in the gray sphere. She's not part of your catalog, but I bet you know where she is. Saldies. Show me where she is. Please. For a second, the squid-faced librarian did not respond. My heart pounded in my own chest with anticipation of failure. But then out whirled one of its arms, to point off down the clear concourse. Take me, I said. The squid turned, abandoned its task, and led the way. Well, here we go then, I said to the knight behind me. I hope you like walking. My stomach was clenched into a tight knot of anxiety, but I picked up my feet to follow the ragged gray robes. What choice did we have? Saldi's could be very far away indeed, we might be about to walk for hours and hours through the mad labyrinth of the library. I needed food and water. Could my bioreactor compensate for those? Worry set in quickly, but I had to keep going. There was no way back. To my incredible relief, Saldi's turned out to not have ventured that far since our last meeting. The squid-faced librarian led us along the wide concourse, then deep into the library stacks themselves, past towering bookcases and shattered wooden floorboards, over mounds of jumbled books and around patches of deep darkness where the glow globes had failed in times long past. It didn't once look back to check if we were following, and didn't respond when I raised my voice to ask it how far away Saldi's might be. I gave up after that, settled into a rhythm of walking. Up a spiral of maddening stairs that seemed to turn back on themselves if one dared look down, across a section of floor populated by lecterns with books chained and bound and roped shut on top of them, past a trio of corpses that looked like dried and shaved gorillas with too many mouths, and then finally deep into the rear of this library floor, almost to the back wall of dark wood. The journey took almost an hour, but just when I was beginning to despair, the librarian led us into a tiny clearing among the bookcases. The clearing contained a sort of tapestry strung between four poles, covered in tiny script in green ink in a language I didn't recognize. The text itself was normal enough, but the way the tapestry was hung made my eyes hurt. It was between four poles, but a casual glance made it seem as if it only had two sides, a front and a rear. But there were four poles in a square formation. Even inside the shelter of the cephalopod skull, I had to blink my watering eyes and look away. And there was the gray sphere machine, sitting opposite the tapestry. Oh, I breathed out as relief flooded me. My heart soared and my head felt light. Oh, thank you. Thank you. I glanced around for the librarian, but the creature was already leaving, robes rustling off down a row of bookcases. Probably for the best I had not forgotten what those things were capable of, in large enough numbers. Best avoid the attention of the library catalog as long as possible. I looked over my shoulder instead, at the forest knight. This is her, I told him. In the sphere. She's well, maybe not a friend, but close enough. If the knight understood, it did not respond. I turned back to the sphere. It was no less bizarre than the first time I'd seen the unearthly machine, 6 feet in diameter and made of thousands of hand-width rectangular prisms, all matte gray and blank and smooth. It was balanced on the floorboards as if given unnatural buoyancy by invisible physical forces, instead of crashing straight through the ground with all its massive weight. It was also closed. Maybe she's sleeping, I murmured. I cleared my throat, straightened my hoodie. Absurd habits, I knew, and then reached out with one hand to knock on the sphere, like I was dropping in for an unannounced visit at the flat of an acquaintance, rather than deep outside and standing before some impossible machinery which I knew contained a person who hadn't been entirely human in a very long time. Knock knock knock, 3 times with my knuckles. Then I cleared my throat again and added, "It's me, Saldi's." Heather Morell." I waited. Nothing happened. "Oh, don't make me wake you up by getting the knight to hit your silly hamster ball with his axe," I hissed in barely contained frustration. I was tired from the walk and more than a little hungry, without the patience for her games. "I need help, Saldi's. Wake up." I gave the sphere an angry thump and skinned a knuckle, then hissed in pain and stuck the hand beneath my mask to suck at the spot I'd grazed. Then, before I could so much as step back to think, the sphere emitted a ripping, tearing, pulping sound, like meat being pulverized and shredded. I jumped about half a foot in the air, tentacles whirling before memory caught up with me. I'd heard that sound before, back when we'd first met Saldi's. The sphere opened, rectangular prisms sliding back like the petals of a mechanical flower of extreme precision, folding up and back and away to reveal the well-lit interior of the sphere and the soft flowing curves of gray that formed the pilot seat. "Saldi's," I said in relief. And there she was, long and slender and neat like a dancer, dark-skinned and gentle-eyed, hair woven into thick masses of braid which fell about her shoulders. Lounging on her comfy seat, she wore an expression half surprised and half bored, blinking slightly with poised and practiced interest, as if woken from a pleasant nap by an overenthusiastic songbird. Like the first time the sphere had opened, she was completely naked from tip to toe and covered in a steaming layer of crimson blood. "Oh," she sighed, rolling her eyes at the ceiling then down at herself. "I am hardly dressed for visitors, you really must give me a moment to ready myself if you're—" "I don't care about that, it doesn't matter." I blurted out, though a tiny part of me was very impressed, not only with the sheer fact of Saldy's nudity, she was remarkably beautiful, even if not my type, but also with how she was completely unself-conscious. She carried herself with the attitude of a queen. "Saldy's, I need help." Help, yes, of course." She smiled as she spoke, a teasing crease in the corners of her eyes. She finally looked up at me and winked. "But when you ask for assistance, you usually let the one petitioned." She trailed off, eyes widening. She uncrossed her legs and leaned forward, staring at me. "Oh, for pity's sake, it's me." I snapped, pulling the cephalopod skull off my head, making a mess of my hair. "It's Heather. Don't tell me you don't remember, or something silly like that. You don't lose all your memories every time you—" I nodded at her gore-soaked nudity and whatever unthinkable process that implied. No, of course not, don't be absurd." She tooted, but her awe did not abate. She wet her lips tasting blood with a little smack of appreciation and gestured at me with both hands. "Lady Morel, forgive me, but you have rather changed since I last laid my poor, plebeian eyes upon you." She paused and pulled a face like she'd bitten into a rotten lemon. "Plebeian, really? Is that the best word you little Englishers have for it? Well, I suppose you're more than a little Englisher, now." "My poor, lowly, oh no, that won't do. My mere gaze." She experimented with a flourish of one hand, then tooted and waved it away like a bad smell. "I know," I said, raising one tentacle. "But I can tell you all about the numismatic editions later. Right now, I need help. I'm stuck and—" "What?" Saldy squinted at me like I was an idiot. "No, I don't mean your arms, Lady Morel. I mean, well, should I be addressing you differently? I know I have a reputation to uphold as a deliciously cheeky and dangerously illegal woman, but I do owe you at least a modicum of proper respect." She gestured at me, up and down. "Especially if your raiment came from where I suspect it did." I boggled at her. "I never asked you to call me lady in the first place." She brightened with a hesitant smile. I suspected the hesitancy was an act, but the smile was real. "Ah, yes, we are on first-name terms, are we not?" "Delightful. I suppose that means you might be willing to introduce me to your as I said, should I be addressing you differently?" "Saldy's, what are you talking about?" She gestured at me again, pulling a perplexed expression, as if it was obvious. "You have donned the purple. Or the yellow." She laughed, a bubbly, relaxed sound. "Same thing. I assume it was from 7 Shades of Sunlight." "Oh, what am I saying, of course it was, who else would you have met?" I blinked at her, dumbfounded, and finally realized what she meant. She could see the yellow cloak Sevens had gifted to me. I tried to draw it tighter, to rub the fabric between my fingers, but it proved as intangible as always. "You mean you can see the—" But Saldy's wasn't listening. She rattled on. "You must tell me everything, I am all ears and a terrible gossip, though I promise my lips are sealed." "Oh, this is delightful. Have you had some kind of ceremony yet, or is this only a betrothal?" My eyes went wide. My mouth opened but no sound came out. Saldy's came up short too, then curled her lips in a wicked smile like a scandalized teenager. She put her fingers to her mouth. "Oh. Oh dear. It's it, I hiccuped hard enough to hurt. "She gave it to me to protect me." "I'll bet she did," Saldy's laughed. You may not have said any vows, little Englisher, but that mantle around your shoulders is an invite to the family. Her family. And I very much doubt that Seven Shades of Sunlight is looking to merely adopt you. You are too much of a catch for that, my dear. A marriage proposal. I moved my mouth and pushed air over my vocal cords, sound came out, but the words couldn't possibly be correct. My voice felt far away, my head was hot and spinning, and my chest tightened with internal pressure as if about to implode around the vacuum of my heart. But Saldes either didn't notice or didn't care. More of a marriage promise, she rambled on, waving a hand in little circles of thought, lounging back against the comfortable gray curves of her machine's pilot seat. Her naked skin was still slathered with a thick layer of gently steaming blood, but somehow she left no stains upon the gray material. You've already accepted it, after all. The proposal stage is over and done with, though, there's a thought. She smiled wide to show perfect teeth and fluttered her lashes, her eyelids sticking together briefly with crimson mess. I would have loved to witness the drama of that moment. Imagine. A pretender to the throne of Carcosa, finding herself a suitable match at long last. All the scheming and thought which must have gone into it. Tell me, please, Lady Morel, did she engineer this danger she was protecting you from? What a little minx. That horrible suggestion brought me round. No, I said, frowning at Saldes in her absurd hamster ball. No, she did not engineer anything. She got burned trying to help and I almost died. She didn't even want to be there in the first place. There's nothing romantic about confronting trauma. I will not hear you suggest such a thing of her. By the time I finished ordering my thoughts, my tentacles were up and ready, as if itching to peel Saldes out of her machine like ripping a mollusk from its shell. The muffled quiet of the library caught the snap of my voice in a silent fist, strangling the sound before an echo could form. My anger was reduced to a trickle of wind whispering off between the bookcases and the stacks of abandoned volumes. Saldes made a big show of raising her hands in surrender, but the gesture was undermined by the roll of her eyes and the smirk on her lips. I'm not the director or playwright here, she said. Don't vent your fury on me, Lady Morel. Take it up with your fiancé. Fiancé, I spat. But in private panic, I searched my memories. Could Sevens have worked backstage, to bring together the necessary elements and force the decisions that had led to Lozzie and I confronting the Eye to save Badger's soul, but then inserted herself at the final moment, all just as an excuse to give me this silken yellow cloak? My fingers unconsciously tried to touch the yellow comfort about my shoulders, the enclosing warmth, this portable hug. In Lozzie's dream world it had felt as warm as sun-kissed skin. Seven's skin. Had it all been a ruse? Had I been on stage the whole time? No, I decided not. I recalled the way Sevens had acted when she'd given me the cloak, her strange reluctance to take the final step, the way her imitation of me had broken down before reasserting itself in nervous hiccups. She had been just as afraid of the Eye as anybody else. Out there in the dream she had burned and bled for me, for real, not an act. Though for something such as her, where did acting end and action begin? But whichever it was, gifting me the cloak had been an act of desperation, not the final move in Seven's perfectly executed plan. The gift had meant something real to her, not merely to the imitative layers she wrapped around the core of her own abyssal truth. Of course, that didn't rule out marriage proposal. I felt a strong urge to don my squid mask once more and hide inside the gray metal bone. My tentacles kept curling and uncurling in a nervous fidget. I even wrapped one around my belly as my stomach began to roil with growing anxiety. Ah, Saldes sighed with all the cloying oiliness of a used car salesman, or at least the Old Norse equivalent of a used car salesman. And now you're seeing how all the pieces have been arranged since the very beginning. She sighed again, this time in the dreamy manner of a preteen with a magazine spread of a favorite pop idol. She leaned forward and attempted to place her blood-soaked chin in one gore-smeared hand, balancing an elbow on her knee, but she was much too covered in wet blood to assume the pose properly. Her elbow slipped from her knee and she whacked herself in the face with the back of her own hand, overbalancing and nearly toppling forward out of her sphere machine. TCH, she tooted and huffed at the fumble. Serves you right. I snorted out a bitter little laugh. And you're wrong. Sevens did not set up anything. Salties recovered her bruised dignity by clearing her throat and gesturing down at her own nude glory, dark skin still steaming with fresh blood. I really must get dressed. This news is the most exciting courtly development in over 50 years and I've completely lost any sense of decorum, but can you blame me? You don't have a sense of decorum. You are being an absolute stirrer. Excuse me. Salties blinked at me with bewilderment. A shit stirrer, I enunciated with great care, doing my best Evelyn impression scowl, then hiccuped loudly enough to pierce the silence of the library for a split second. Swearing made me feel like a very bad girl indeed, even though I'd learnt that particular word from Rain. I even glanced back over my shoulder at the forest knight, still standing behind me in a pose of relaxed readiness, his axe slung over one shoulder. I felt as if I should apologize for my foul language, but the knight did not appear to care. He just did his self-appointed duty, standing by on guard. Salties wiggled her bottom in her seat. Lips pursed as if to hold back a laugh. Guilty as charged, but I am also correct. And being right is worth any amount of stirring. Oh, what a delightful phrase, shit stirrer. I believe I shall add it to my list of titles. I shook my head, as much at myself as at Salties, along with this ridiculous notion she was peddling. Look, I don't have time for this. Salties, I'm here because I need your help, because I'm in the middle of a crisis, an emergency. A much more pressing emergency than fictitious marriage proposals from outsider godling daughters. Salties raised her eyebrows in polite interest, so I went on. I'm stuck. Stuck outside, because something is preventing me from returning home an intelligence, a purpose. It manifests as hands that grab my ankles when I try to leave, but they're not literally hands, that's just interpretation. I think it might be the remains of a mage I killed once, but I don't know. And I need to find Lozzie first. Do you remember her? Salties nodded, though slightly detached, with forced politeness. And I need to get her out too, because the same force is probably going to hold her back when she tries to return home. But I don't know what outside dimension she's gone to. I need help to break the hands, defeat them, I don't know. Salties waited a beat, then dipped her head in puff-faced acknowledgement. You are trapped on this branch, this bough, here, in Carcosa. No, not just here, I sighed with exhaustion as I rounded on the problem again. I can move from dimension to dimension, outside, but not back to Earth. Whenever I try, it's like hands gripping at my ankles. I can't beat them because it happens in the space between, the membrane, the gap, I can't do things there. Salties pulled a real heavy pinch of a frown, squinted her eyes and wrinkled her nose, the complete works, as if I was talking distasteful nonsense. She wet her lips, taking a tiny taste of the blood all over her skin, then slowly raised one hand. I braced for magic, for her unique and bizarre flesh-splitting physical incantation. I really must get dressed, she said, and without further warning, her gray sphere machine began to fold shut, the exterior blocks sliding over each other and back into place. A moment, please, Lady Morel, she said as the machine closed around her like a Venus flytrap. The gray surface slid shut without a sound. All of a sudden I was alone in the library of Carcosa once more. Alone with Lozzie's knight at my back. Alone with my thoughts. I let out a huge sigh and rubbed the bridge of my nose, squeezing my eyes shut to avert an onrushing stress headache. I was very, very hungry, despite the bioreactor purring away in my gut to supply me with raw energy. My legs were tired enough that two of my tentacles had wrapped around them to act as braces against the floorboards, like a pneumosomatic-powered exoskeleton. I might have been more adapted to survive outside than ever before, but I still needed food and water, rest and warmth, and eventually a shower and some sleep. Human or not, my core was still flesh and my brain was still meat. Before I could stop myself, my fingers twitched to pull Seven's cloak tighter around my shoulders, to instinctively wrap myself in comfort's warm embrace. Oh, tch, I tooted when I realized, blushing bright red. I wrapped a tentacle around my shoulders instead. A marriage proposal, really? Ridiculous. Absurd notion. Clearly my subconscious did not agree. One hand tried to smooth my hair down, raking it into a semblance of order, while the other straightened my pink hoodie, then wavered when I realized I couldn't do anything about the nosebleed stains I'd wiped all over my right sleeve. Face still burning red and with a guilty barb in my chest, I glanced around the little clearing of bookshelves, trying not to look at the impossible tapestry in the middle. But it wasn't outside physics making my stomach churn and my palms sweat. I half expected to see a white mask peeking around a corner to watch me with shy interest, like a timid character from one of Evelyn's more irritating anime shows. I even checked behind the forest-patterned knight, but there was no embarrassed mass of yellow on the other side of him either. "Tell me if you see her, okay?" I asked him. His helmet went up and down in a neat, covert nod. I filled my lungs, placed a hand over my fluttering heart, and cursing myself for a romantic fool called out to 7 shades of sunlight. Sevens. Sevens, I don't care what you've done or not done, or what it means or doesn't mean. I just need help getting home. I don't know what's happening to Rain, or Evie, or anybody else. I'm terrified and barely holding myself together, and you must know that. You care about my drama, my story, don't you? Well, if I can't get home, it ends here. Outside. Alone. I kept my eyes peeled for a whisper of dawnbreak gold, a hint of warm honey on the air, or a butterscotch flutter behind a bookcase. But none came. A moment later, Saldy's sphere machine slid open again like an otherworldly egg disgorging a live parrot with rampant plumage of red and gold. The gray blocks slid back to reveal Saldy's cleaned of her gruesome layer of steaming blood and clad in a thick-spun red dress, from chin to toes, showing almost no skin except her face and hands. It wasn't the same dress she'd worn the first time we'd met her. This was much flashier. A truly massive amount of gold thread was woven into the fabric, in an ostentatious design that showed a rearing snake dragon against a field of stars, with a vanquished wolf beneath its coils. A golden raven was inlaid on either shoulder, as if whispering up into her ears. She wore a dozen heavy necklaces with gold pendants, some with triple triangle interlocking designs, some with little inverted hammers, others with trees or boars, and one that had no pendant but instead a runic inscription in what I assumed was Old Norse. Her fingers glittered with rings and her wrists jangled with gold bangles as she leaned back in her seat and tossed one leg over the other. In her lap lay a trio of massive black rats, half asleep with their little eyes heavily lidded, all curled up against each other and looking very comfortable indeed, as if they'd been napping there for hours. They were the healthiest rats I'd ever seen, glossy-furred and sleek and perfectly groomed, but each one must have weighed almost 2 pounds, more than enough to make the boldest cat think twice. Somehow I doubted they were earthly rats at all, not really. Saldy's lowered a hand to pet one of them along its spine. I blinked at her in surprise. She must have caught the look on my face. "Flaunt it if you got it," she said with a satisfied smile, then frowned. "Oh dear. Oh, that is just crass. But I suppose I do got it. Don't think your mantle is so impressive that I can't match up in my own way." I didn't have to exert effort to scowl that time. "Saldies, this is not a catwalk contest. I can't even see this." I tried to pluck at Seven's cloak to make my point. She smiled with infuriating indulgence and scratched one of her pet rats under the chin. It nuzzled her hand. "So you say, Lady Morel. Have no fear, though, I would never upstage either bride at the event itself. I will keep myself strictly within reasonable bounds." She suddenly lit up. "That is, assuming you are not going to elope." "Oh, how exciting." I silently counted to 10, casting about for a conversational and emotional handhold. Her fingertips to her mouth, eyes shining with a sheen of dramatic tears as she glanced out of the opening of her sphere machine, at the bookcases all around, looking for the same evidence of a hidden watcher as I had done. I did not know. I have a front row seat, right here, to the greatest confession scene I am ever likely to witness. How did the beginning of it play out? I am dying to know. It's not a marriage proposal. I exploded at her. No, you must be misinterpreting this. Or you're messing with me. Saldes put her hand over her heart. By the fire at the center of creation, I am not teasing you, Lady Morel. I threw my hands and tentacles up in utter exasperation. Words burst from me, unplanned and uncontrolled, the truth of my feelings. I just can't believe it, I can't. It's nonsense. I am hardly a catch. Look at me. I'm covered in my own blood and I stink of vomit. I am an absolute nightmare, my life is a mess, I'm half abyssal squid, and that's when I'm feeling good about myself and I'm on a collision course with an outsider god that I still don't know how to beat. I'm weird and ugly and I don't fully expect to make it through the next year. I'm going to end up dead if I don't get everything right. I'm not exactly a lot of fun, either. 7 Shades of Sunlight clearly disagrees with your self-assessment, said Saldes. A sense of déjà vu crept over me. I'd been here before, in another secluded spot, running down the list of my faults and failures in front of another suitor who I'd judged worthy of so much more than scrawny little disaster Heather Morel. Blushing, flushed in the face, deeply self-conscious of my messy clothes and unwashed hair, I risked another glance at the corners of the bookcases and the dark nooks between rows. I just realized I wasn't really arguing with Saldes at all. She was right about one thing 7 Shades of Sunlight probably was observing. I was talking to her. And in sevens is so, I murmured. Mad thoughts stampeded through my head. If I accepted, if I said yes no, that was absurd. I dialed back. If I acknowledged Seven's feelings, if not a bloody marriage proposal, what would that mean? My imagination summoned an image of Sevens as me, leaning in close for a kiss. I rejected that with instinctive revulsion. It would be too much like kissing the memory of Maisie. Could she appear as Rain instead? That would be even worse, a horrible falsehood, almost a betrayal. Unless Rain agreed no, I physically shook my head, that was too weird. Or would she appear as herself? Her true self, the beautiful marine form of infinite buttermilk ruffles and trailing tendrils of young fire, the canary flesh and scent of fresh lemon. That thought made my mouth go dry and my heart flutter against my ribs like a caged bird. Besides, I tried to rally by denying it out loud. I'm taken, twice over. I have enough difficulty just with Rain, let alone Jing too, and that's hardly resolved as it is. My love life is complex enough when I'm already living in a polyamorous triangle where the other 2 angles of said triangle still want to have a no-holds-barred fistfight. And I don't even have sex with Jing, yet. If ever. My life is complex enough as it is. Saldes blinked at me quite hard, struggling to suppress a disbelieving smirk. What? I snapped. Goodness, Lady Morel. And you wonder why 7 Shades of Sunlight might possibly be interested in you? Yes, fine. As a protagonist in one of her plays. Not as a partner. I struggled with the word, blushing heavily. I tried to cast my mind back to when Sevens had saved me from slipping into the abyss, when I'd been clawing my way back to the submarine shore of bare rock and she'd reached down and lifted me up. She'd told me about the principle of building an anchor for myself, and how she could not intervene a second time because that was not in her nature. It was not what she was. That's not how she works, I said out loud. That's not what she is. She made that very clear to me, once. She doesn't get involved, it's counter to her nature, or something. Saldes shrugged an eloquent, rolling shrug. What can change the nature of a woman? I rolled my eyes in exasperated surrender, but then my heart went cold with realization. I had changed Sevens. I'd made her involve herself, to save me, not just that once, but then a second time, in front of the eye. She'd helped, been burned for her trouble, been wounded and grown tearful, and then gifted me a piece of herself. A piece of her heart. And think how rare it must be, Saldes prattled on while I was busy having an emotional crisis, for one such as her to encounter anything remotely like a suitable match, one of the same sophistication and ability, let alone the same social station. Adopted or not, Lady Morel, you are a sort of princess too. Or had you forgotten that? I cleared my throat. I am decidedly anti-monarchist, thank you very much. Oh dear. Well, I couldn't agree more, personally. I've done a spot of regicide myself, though rather a long time ago now. She lowered her voice to a silly stage whisper. But don't let your father-in-law to be hear you saying that. Saldes wiggled her eyebrows meaningfully, then seemed to rethink her words and tapped her chin with one long-nailed finger. Or maybe you should, considering his reported exploits. He might approve of a little neck-cutting here and there. My glare was faltering, but Saldes humored me by putting her hands up in teasing mock surrender. This is all academic, anyway, I said. If she can't or won't help me, I still need to get out of here. I still need to find Lozzie. I don't have time for this drama. Will you help or? Clank. Lozzie's forest pattern knight made a sound of metal on metal by adjusting the axe it held over one shoulder. I instantly whipped around, tentacles whirling. Sevens. The knight held one hand outstretched, gauntlet curled to point index finger straight at a bookcase. Hardback spines in browns and blacks and worryingly pale shades of soft leather, punctuated by crumbling pages of ancient grimoires that had lost their bindings, and those few bound in more esoteric materials girded with bone or wrapped in steel or plated with ancient wood. A jumble of tomes and texts and not a Sevens in sight, not peering around a corner or over the top of the bookcase, nor hiding in the implausibly narrow gaps between the tops of the books and the underside of each shelf. Then, as I dragged my gaze away, she coalesced in the periphery of my vision, among the chaos of the books themselves. The ragged spines and dog-eared corners and buckled covers conspired to form an outline of yellow, like an optical illusion or magic eye picture rising from the chaos. A suggestion of shape burst into life, a petite female figure wrapped in windswept robes, peeking around the edge of a low wall, shy and coquettish, backed by sun-baked dunes. The image existed only in the precise angle at which one looked at the rows of books. I flinched in surprise, but that hid the optical illusion from my sight, returning the bookcases to just visual noise. Squinting, blinking, I caught only scraps, and saw that she was moving, that she had recoiled with the shock of being spotted, though the shift in image was generated purely by the new position I had adopted. The books themselves had not changed, neither had the light, nothing had moved, yet as my perspective shifted so did this furtive pretender. 6 months ago, such an impossible effect would have sent me into screaming confusion, but now I adapted. Quickly, using all my powers of pneumosomatic body modification, I formed tiny screws of extra muscle behind my eyes and forced them to unfocus, grimacing through the sudden pain. And there she was. 7 shades of Desert Sprite, fleeing across the sands. She leapt to the next bookcase in the row like a painting come to life and jumping from frame to frame. Sevens. I cried, outraged as much as I was surprised. Don't run away. I lashed out with a tentacle to catch her by an ankle, but of course I only knocked books off a shelf. Inside the magic eye image, Seven stumbled over a sudden pit in the sand dug by my fumble. She recovered with a little hop that made my heart skip. Where? Where? I don't see a thing. Saldes was squawking from behind me, utterly inconsolable that she was missing the action. Seven's run reached the end of the row of bookcases, where a chasm of 8 or 9 feet separated her from another camouflaging canvas of book spines. I thought she might slip around the corner or vanish, but she hit the edge of the books and exploded into real space, the illusion shattering in a whipping flurry of thick yellow silk that seemed to pour from nowhere. For a fleeting moment, that yellow silk wrapped around a petite female figure, or took the shape of one, as if caught on an invisible human outline in a gale of wind. She was glancing back over her shoulder at me, caught in a frozen moment of flight, facial features nothing but folds of fabric. Behind me, Saldes gasped in awe. Then the silk whipped away in the grip of a hurricane, vanishing behind the bookcases, leaving nothing but empty space. Sevens. I snapped, hurrying across the floorboards and skidding to a halt, grabbing a bookcase with my tentacles to spin myself around and after the fleeing yellow fabric. But the row beyond was empty. Silence and shadows and marching volumes greeted me. A couple of squid-faced librarians shuffled about in the middle distance. "Oh, for crying out loud, Sevens," I said. I couldn't help myself, red in the face with both embarrassment and anger. Now is not the time to play at being a shrinking violet. Come out. Right this instant. No buttersoft fingers curled around the corner of a bookcase. We can. Sevens, if you come and talk to me, we can talk about what this means. We can talk, right now, and I will give you an answer. If you come out right now. I promise. Last chance. No sunburst, I lit up in the shadows. For pity's sake, Sevens. My friends, my family might be in trouble, back in reality. The hands trapping me here might be part of a plan. If something happens to Rain, or Evie, or anybody else, I won't ever be able to forgive you for not helping me. No lock of flaxen hair floated among the shelves. Sevens was well and truly hiding. Oh dear me, Saldes was cooing back in the clearing, rather uselessly. Matsogner, you're up, little one. Off you go now. Be swift. Little ratty claws skittered across the floorboards and one of the three massive black rats slipped between my feet to skitter off down the row of bookcases, sniffing and snuffling like a bloodhound. He ran in a circle, pointed his nose in the air, then slipped off around a corner. The sound of tiny claws was soon swallowed up in the thickly cloying silence of the library. I turned to Saldes, wide-eyed with surprise. She was petting the other two rats. How is he supposed to get far in this place? I asked. He's big, but not that big. Dverger have their own paths through the great trunk, she purred, pulling a smugly enigmatic smile. More importantly, Lady Morel, I think it's safe to assume that your friends and companions back in Midgard are perfectly untouched by whatever mysterious malicious forces you're worried about. I hardly heard her, glancing off down the row of bookcases again, pursing my lips in irritation at Sevens. I huffed and stomped back into the clearing, back to Saldes and the forest knight. What makes you so confident about that? I demanded, still scowling through my blush. If her fiancé's comrades were in dire danger, surely 7 shades of sunlight would overcome her fear and help you ride to their rescue. Why, it's a perfect tale, a perfect performance. You think she would pass that up? I suppose you have a point. I wrapped a tentacle around my stomach again, trying to still the roiling anxiety in my guts. Still. Fiancé. I shook my head. You still doubt? Not after that. I tooted. An outsider godling, behaving like a 14-year-old with a crush. Really? She won't even confront me, this is absurd. I don't need this right now, I need help. Saldes fluttered her eyelashes. A maiden's heart is such a delicate thing. And yellow is also a synonym for coward. I cast my blushing scowl over the bookcases and spines and the shadows between the rows, over the wooden floorboards and the underside of the next floor up, the glow globes and the dust-thick library air. Sevens was still watching, I was certain of it, and a spiteful, wounded part of me hoped she'd heard me question her courage. Oh, Saldes was in full dramatic flow. You cast a spear at her heart, Lady Morel. I never knew you were such a cruel woman. Stop it, please, I sighed. But Saldes wasn't entirely wrong, I was being cruel. Even in the height of crisis, I was forced to consider the possibility that Sevens really had gifted me the cloak purely as protection against the eye, but that it was also a symbol of marriage proposal at the same time. Both things could be true, and she was deeply embarrassed at the unavoidable implication, or at the revealed truth. But none of that excused her reaction right then. I was also forced to confront the opposite possibility: what if Sevens had planned all of this? What if I was dancing on her stage? If she wouldn't face me, I couldn't answer any of those questions. I had to stay focused. Saldes prattled on. But if she declines the meeting, it can only mean she is waiting for the right moment. No. The perfect moment. Saldes, I said, pulling my hoodie tighter around my shoulders, raising my chin, and tucking in my tentacles. Saldes, forget Sevens. Can you help me get home or not? Can you help me defeat the dead hands, with magic? Saldes stopped mid-word, rather unimpressed, then sighed and shrugged. She sat back, waved a bored hand, and concentrated on petting the pair of rats left in her lap. Oh, I suppose so. It's a bit pedestrian, but I don't see why not, other than the risk of stepping on the toes of a pretender's plan. But I suppose I must be part of the plan too. Perhaps. In any case, go ahead, show me. She waved vaguely in my direction. Show you? Yes. Of course. I need first-hand experience of the phenomenon that's troubling you. She raised a rat up on one palm to make eye-level contact with him, then made a saccharine kissy faces at the rodent. Even I'm not skilled enough to fix a problem blind. Show me, please. It's not something that happens in real space, I sighed. I suppose you can see the cloak, so maybe you can see that too. Saldes caught my eye with a tiny smirk and patted the inside of her sphere machine. Do not forget that I am not my 5 senses, little Englisher. You've gained some fancy limbs and more than a touch of royal favor, but I've been around a lot longer than you. Somehow, her smile, her confidence, was the exact balm I needed in that moment. Saldes would get me home. She was awful and irritating, but she could do this for me. Even if this was Alexander holding me back, Saldes was older and wiser and stronger. She would know how to snap his wrists. Perhaps owe her a good word with Sevens, but all that could be dealt with later, after I was home or had found Lozzie or had burned the dead hands down into ash. All right, I said, taking a deep breath and steeling myself for the pain. I didn't want to have to do this again, but all right. Watch closely. Have no fear, Lady Morel. My eyes are peeled. I handed my outsider squid skull to the forest knight, wrapped myself with my tentacles to brace for the inevitable return, and closed my eyes. The equation was second nature by then, a click of my fingers, a flick of the wrist, like taking a hop across a barrier that was becoming progressively thinner with every transition. Out. Cold hands closed around my ankles. The membrane spat me back out in a welter of blood and pain and disorientation. This time I had expected that same result and readied myself, tentacles braced and hugging me tight to keep me on my feet. But even with the forest knight placing one metal hand against the small of my back, I still staggered and sagged, bent double as I spat strings of bile onto the library floorboards. My stomach felt like a void. I was so hungry. Ugh, I groaned, wiping nosebleed all over my pink sleeve and waiting for my vision to stop throbbing black at the edges. Sevens, if you're really in love with me, can't you at least spare me from more of this? My whispered plea received no reply. I grumbled some more and spat on the floor and finally managed to pull myself upright, leaning against the knight. Saldes was staring at me like she'd seen a ghost. She'd actually gone pale with fright, a condition I'd believed she was incapable of. She was cuddling the rats in her lap as if to shelter them. Saldes. I croaked, wiping my mouth on the back of my hand, feeling like some kind of filthy vomit goblin. I don't think I can help you, Lady Morel, she said, voice oddly hushed. What? She shook her head, swallowed with awkward delicacy, and seemed to come round somewhat. This is no mere drogher at your heels, my lady. This is vengeance. What in all creation did you do to attract this sort of anger? I murdered a mage and destroyed his life's work, I told her, not without a hint of pride, which instantly made me feel sick with guilt. Well, Saldes sighed. I cannot help you with this. Can't or won't. I grunted, trying to ignore the crushing pressure on my chest again, trying to keep my head clear. If she couldn't help me, I was truly stuck. Can't. She lit up with a smile, though intensely awkward even on her laugh-lined face. Those who keep going after they lose their bodies are not but spite and regret, an old form of magic indeed, and not to be countered with mere skill. You cannot fight such a thing with anger and revulsion either, because yours will never match their own. The only way out is, well, she cleared her throat and grimaced. One must lay the dead to rest. Apologize and forgive. Forgive? I hissed. Absolutely. And you have to mean it. Saying sorry in a contrite tone is not good enough. I shook my head, racked with painful aftershock. The forest knight handed me my squid mask and I almost slipped it on without thinking, but then hugged it tight instead, like a protective talisman. I think forgiveness rather out of the question. I don't think I'm capable of that, not in this case. Quite. Saldes sighed. The man in question is dead, you are not dealing with him, but forgiveness is not the easy path. If it was, more would take it and none would sing of revenge. Nevertheless, you cannot hate forever, little Englisher. It eats you inside. I sighed and felt my shoulders slump. Apologize and forgive? Give me a few months, less of a crisis, and a good therapist or two for Lozzie as well, and perhaps I would be able to approach the concept of forgiving Alexander Lilban, maybe, from a distance, after Zheng had defiled his grave and cracked his bones. He killed children, I said, and surprised myself with the choke in my voice. He hurt his own sister, my friend. I can't. Saldes nodded and gave me a sad smile. Yes, it is hard to forgive monsters. That is why this is so effective. At least I know it must be him now, I muttered, then took a deep breath and tried to put him from my mind. You really can't help me fight the hands off. Hurt them, make them stop. Saldes shook her head. A lump formed in my throat. Once again. I was trapped and Lozzie was trapped. I groped for anything, any handhold I could find. There had to be another way back, another way across the membrane. I sagged back on my tentacles, using them like extra legs against the floorboards, badly wanting to sit down, lie down, close my eyes and curl up in a ball and slip off to sleep. Saldes, how did you get here? Originally, I mean. You came from Earth from Midgard, didn't you? Saldes blinked at me with polite surprise. Why, I climbed down Yggdrasil, of course. I frowned at her through sandy eyes. The world tree of Norse mythology. What does that mean? Saldes shrugged and leaned back inside her machine. One of her rats rolled over in her lap. I climbed down the trunk, across the roots, and then went wherever I wished. Of course, I couldn't have done it like this, she gestured at herself, at her flesh and bone body. Wait, you mean this literally? You climbed down a giant tree? The world tree? She frowned at me. Yes. What else would I mean? But you said you've never met a god. The gods, in general. How can the tree? I shook my head. We have completely different cultural contexts. You mean there is a place, a real, physical place you can climb up some giant roots and return to Midgard? Of course. Saldes looked me up and down quickly and cleared her throat. I wouldn't attempt it as you are though. No amount of royal favor and no occupy, just like every previous attempt. I tooted and fussed, one of my tentacles paffing at where the fabric should be. Saldes sighed and pulled an infuriatingly indulgent shrug, more with her palms than her shoulders. Well, if that's what you say, you have even less to worry about. How can it be both invisible and yellow? I huffed at the feeling of the invisible cloak, the warmth snug about my shoulders. It's the invisible pink unicorn problem, illustrated in reality. Oh, I do hate this. Damn you, Sevens. Excuse me. Nothing, I sighed. Something Rain taught me. Philosophy, about the existence of God, or gods. How horribly relevant. 7 Shades of Sunlight herself was one thing she undoubtedly existed, no matter how many layers of mask she wore or whose face she imitated. I'd seen her with my own eyes, both in the flesh and in the abyss. I'd seen past her masks to the truth beneath, all her alien complexity and robust abyssal beauty like secret life at the bottom of a marine trench. I could touch her and verify she was real. But her father, the king? The King in Yellow was from a book, a set of unremarkable short horror stories written in the late 19th century. Since meeting Sevens, I'd read that book from cover to cover 3 times, trying to glean the slightest clue from those confused snippets of fiction. The first time we'd encountered this strange crossover between fiction and reality, Evelyn had launched into an outraged rant, firm and unyielding in her belief that the Yellow King could not exist, that all those old stories were just nonsense pulp from 100 years ago. At the time I'd mostly dismissed her anger. After all, it stood to reason that any fiction could contain kernels of truth. What if the person who wrote those stories had encountered the real Yellow King, long ago? Why not process that experience into fiction rather than writing down some squalid occult tome that nobody would take as real? The King in Yellow had endured and thrived as fiction, far better than it ever would have as one of those crumbling books from Evelyn's secret collection beneath Sherrowford University Library. But I'd only been able to accept that because it was a purely academic question. Now it was rapidly becoming a practical problem. Perhaps paradoxically, that made it a philosophical issue. Why can't things just be simple? I hissed to myself. In that rather lame collection of short stories, the entity known as the King in Yellow was poorly defined, a haunting presence in a fictional play that drove its audience insane, a name whispered in rotting tenements while the fog roiled outside, a creeping suggestion of watching and observing, reinterpreted and rewritten dozens of times in the years since. The King in Yellow was not merely a fictional entity, it was created by the process of fictional reimagining, like the compacting of silt on a lake bed to eventually create rock. So what would I be going to meet? Something not unlike the Eye. A being which had dragged itself from the dark of the abyss under its own power, whatever it had been before. Sevens had told me that her father the king had begun life as something not unlike a human being. Perhaps that's why he had a family, something comprehensible on a mortal level, rather than the Eye's dead globe of Wonderland. I was going to meet Seven's dad. I was also covered in my own blood, stank of fierce sweat and vomit, and was so hungry I could have eaten my own fingers. A great first impression. How would I have reacted to meeting Rain's father? Well, bad example. I probably would have tried to punch the man with a tentacle. Don't do that to the king, I told myself. I doubt he'd be willing to help after a tentacle fight. If I meet the King in Yellow, I said out loud to Saldes, anxiety clutching at my chest, what exactly will I see? Saldes raised her eyebrows. To my surprise, the pair of rats in her lap paused as well, sitting up on their hind legs and looking right at me with their tiny black eyes. A very good question, Saldes said, voice low and husky, as if she was telling a horror story around a campfire. Just what I needed, I almost rolled my eyes. I've never had the pleasure in person, though I have heard all the tales. Usually he is not somebody you would wish to meet, not if he is actively seeking you out, especially when wearing some of his other guises. Other guises? You know how it goes, a king or a prince wants to go among the common people, so he dons a disguise. But for one of such majesty, nature is difficult to conceal. When the king walks abroad, those who meet him know they have been met. It is impossible to mistake him for a mere pretender to the throne, or even for one of his closest family. He will certainly show you a mask too, Lady Morel. I doubt very much that either of us wants to see the unfiltered truth. Neither would I want to deal with one of his displeased masks, but the library has been quiet for a long time, Hastur hasn't passed through in decades, so I suspect the king's mood is still amiable. Hastur. I echoed the strange name and instantly regretted it. From Saldis the word had sounded normal, not one of those twisted unwords that made the mouth and throat bleed and seared human ears with supernatural pain. But in my mouth the word felt like a live slug. I stopped to retch, clutching at my chest, and would have vomited if I didn't have extensive experience in holding back nausea. Yes, has Saldis cut off with a tut, blazing an angry frown all of a sudden. You almost made us say it 3 times between us. Don't. I spat on the floorboards, trying to wash away a taste that was not a taste, a phantom sensation of something wet and wriggling and rancid. The bioreactor in my abdomen suddenly spiked its power output, thrumming hard in my gut, purging an invader that I'd accidentally invited inside, merely by speaking a word. For a few seconds my skin burned fever hot and a flash sweat broke out beneath my clothes. But the bioreactor did its job, fueling impossible processes, churning out pneumosomatic approximations of macrophages and eosinophils to surge through my bloodstream and fight off the infection. The fever passed and I straightened up, panting and blinking, wiping sweat off my face. Saldis was still frowning at me, like I'd done something wrong, hands on her hips inside her sphere machine. You could have warned me, I spluttered. She shrugged. I did. Don't say that name 3 times. It's obvious, it should feel obvious. Besides, it's common knowledge. I thought you had a little mage or 2 among your comrades, didn't you? The blonde one with the terrible attitude and the dangerous eyes. Dangerous eyes? I filed that one away for later. Yes, okay. I get the picture. I spat on the floorboards again, though I had regained enough composure to once again feel the pressures of being a goody 2-shoes, so I turned and hid the gesture behind one hand. I wouldn't want to invoke that aspect of the King of Yellow even if I was completely inert at the time. Saldis was saying. She gestured up with both hands at the inside of her grey sphere machine. Best not speak of the devil, yes. Oh, this bodes really well for meeting him, I muttered. All I'd done was speak the name of one of the king's masks, but if I had still been mere ape, without my pneumosomatic additions and changes, without my abdominal reactor and my adaptive biology, what would have happened to me just then? My hands were still shaking with adrenaline and my t-shirt was plastered to my back with sweat. Whatever assault I'd just come under, my body had awakened to a real fight, not just brushed off a lazy exploratory tentacle. Seven's father, once something like us, great playwright and director, patriarch and monarch, whatever the King in Yellow was, first and foremost he was an outsider god. Like the eye. I forced myself to take a deep breath, I had no other choice, except to give up, lie down, and die. I'd faced the eye, I could face this. It's all right for you inside your shell, I said to Saldis, transmuting my terror into flippant grumpiness. I finally understood why Evelyn did this all the time. The rest of us can't simply retract our necks and hide from consequences. Contrary to my expectations, Saldis got all smug when I said that. As a lifestyle, I highly recommend it, she purred. I frowned at her, distracting myself with a silly thought. Saldis, are you a snail? Excuse me? You're sort of like a human snail, aren't you? I mean it seriously, I'm not trying to insult you. Since I last saw you, I have had some experience with how mages can eventually end up. You're a human core inside some kind of mage snail shell. Aren't you? Saldis' expression went through a fascinating slow-motion change, growing more and more disgusted with every second of contemplation. She looked away, out at the library, then at the pair of big black rats in her lap who were happily rolling on their backs. She cleared her throat, expression getting even worse as she twisted her lips together. Well, that is to say I'm right, aren't I? No. Maybe. No. Absolutely not. I will not accept that description. A snail? You do carry your home on your back. But still. Look, Saldes, I said, seizing the opportunity while she was off balance. I'm not worried about the king in yellow punishing me for seducing his daughter, that would be absurd. I'm worried about the vast gulf between what I am and what he is. Do you understand? How can I possibly communicate with something like that? Saldes tooted, still faintly offended. You communicate with 7 shades, do you not? Well enough for her to fall for you. The trick is to speak clearly. And listen carefully when spoken to. I sighed and ran a hand over my face, followed by a tentacle. I really didn't have a choice. If things took a turn for the worst, I could always slip out, back to the quiet plain, assuming the king couldn't stop me. I glanced over my shoulder at the forest-pattern knight still standing silent and unmoving. Are you willing to walk into this with me? I asked him softly. His helmet went up and down, just a single jerk of his chin. I nodded back and curled a tentacle tip around his empty gauntlet. At least I had one normal companion out there. That thought made me puff out a breath of dark laughter. A pneumosomatic spirit given real flesh and piloting a suit of outsider steel now counted not only as a comrade, but normal compared to the surroundings. He was as far out of his element here as I was. Saldes, okay, so, the palace. How do I get to? But as I turned back to Saldes, I noticed we'd attracted an audience. A single squid-faced librarian stood in one of the gaps between 2 bookcases, as if it had just walked around the corner, turned, and stopped. It was totally motionless, gray hands tucked into its sleeves, face tentacles slack. Despite the lack of sensory organs in its eyeless gray face of tentacles and spines, I felt like I was being watched, intently, by something of great intelligence. Saldes leaned forward out of her pilot's seat to follow the direction of my shock. Her rats clung to her skirts with their little claws. Oh, she went, raising her eyebrows. That's unexpected. I wonder what it wants. I said. That's new behavior. Saldes, the last time we saw unorthodox behavior from these things, it was very bad. And that's an understatement. My tentacles drifted upward as if to defend myself from attack, but the librarian just stood there, perfectly still. In a sudden blur of metal, the forest knight swung past me, unlimbering his axe from his shoulder in one smooth motion and dropping the haft down into a 2-handed fighting stance. His footsteps hit the floorboards without a sound. No. I squeaked, shooting out one tentacle to grab him by the elbow. He stopped right away. If he'd pulled, I doubted I could have restrained him. Don't antagonize them, I said softly. Don't make it worse. The librarian hadn't even flinched. Saldes pursed her lips. I suspect the content of our deliberations has attracted attention, but not from the catalog. It wouldn't care. Somebody's taken an interest, somebody with enough authority to personally hijack a librarian. Hello there. She waved her fingers at the insensate squid-faced puppet, but it didn't react, so she sighed and shrugged and sat back, winking at me instead. Best you not stick around in this spot much longer, yes? If you've drawn attention, the family's already onto you. Best get to somewhere nice and official with lots of witnesses. Then she nodded at the forest-patterned knight, her voice turning to a flirtatious purr. Your big fellow there is quite the eager one, isn't he? I tore my eyes away from the grey librarian with some difficulty, heart pounding in my chest. What exactly was watching us? I told myself I was better off not knowing. Maybe we were talking too loud in the library, I muttered, then hiccuped out a strangled laugh. Excuse me. Nothing, I said, rallying my thoughts. I can't stay here, yes. Saldes, how do I reach the palace? You mentioned the front of the library, but as far as I can tell the library is infinite in 3 directions. Where do I go? Not infinite. Saldes sighed like I was small child failing to add 2 and 2. Oh, little Englisher, nothing is infinite. Not even my appetites. She cracked a terrible smile and let out a cackle, her eyes traveling up and down the forest knight's armor without guile. Even the rats appeared to cringe. The library has a front entrance, of course. How else would anybody get in? Well, present company excepted. She gestured at me. Yes, but how can I reach it? You walk there, with your little feets on the ends of your little leggies. How else? Perhaps your chap there can carry you. She nodded at the knight. Wouldn't mind that myself. I tried very hard not to kill her with my eyes. I need to get back today. Tonight. I don't even know how many hours have passed since I left. I was asleep on the floor, for crying out loud. I snapped, losing control of my anger and fear again, trying not to think about Rain and Evelyn and Lozzie, shooting an angry glance at the silent, watching librarian. And I'm ravenously hungry. I don't know about your bloody hamster ball, Saldies, but I cannot walk for 3 months or 3 years until we find the front door. Saldies raised an eyebrow, delicately offended. She even folded her arms, which messed up the perfect lines of her golden-embroidered red dress. I sighed, closed my eyes, and pinched the bridge of my nose. I'm sorry. None of this is your fault, I forced myself to say. I apologize for snapping. Quite understandable, Lady Morel. Saldies, how did you get here from the front? But when I opened my eyes I choked off my words and did a double take. Our single-watching squid-faced librarian had brought some friends. Now 3 of them stood in the gap between the bookshelves, shoulder to shoulder in perfect stillness. Several more ragged grey-robed figures were drifting in behind them. Saldies leaned forward to follow my gaze again, then froze. Ah, she said, voice suddenly tight. Faster escalation than I expected. There's more, I said with a quiver in my voice. I pointed left, at the opposite exit from the little library clearing. Another pair of grey librarians stood there, as if blocking a potential retreat, slowly being joined by more shuffling down the bookcase rows. I looked over my shoulder at the direction from which I had entered the clearing and found a further 4 squid faces staring back at me in silent regard, a small crowd beginning to gather behind. One of the librarians took a shuffling, zombie-like step forward, bare grey feet edging into the clearing. Then another did the same. Then a third. The first trickle of an avalanche began to converge toward Saldies and me. The forest knight adjusted his footing, drawing closer to my back and leveling his axe to protect me. He crowded me toward the sphere machine, the only retreat still available, though it led us nowhere. My stomach clenched up hard, my skin broke out in cold sweat, and damn the consequences, I thought I narrowly ignored the urge to slip the squid skull back over my head. Saldies and I looked at each other. What does this mean? I asked. I thought you said it wasn't the catalog. She shrugged. None of us are totally infallible, despite very good track records. I was wrong. Wrong. Ahaha, wrong. She laughed, and I did not like the edge of hysteria in her voice. The issue of leaving in a hurry is becoming rather pressing, no? She sat back in her machine and ran her eyes over the unfolded entrance. Don't you hide in your shell. I snapped at her. Wouldn't dream of it. All around us, more librarians were beginning to shuffle into the clearing. A ring was forming, centered on me and Saldies. Besides, it's not I who has to worry. Observe. Saldies' sphere machine suddenly backed up from me by about 6 feet, clicking across the floorboards in its strange rolling locomotion, the grey blocks flowing over the outer surface without disturbing the interior. It looked as if Saldies and her pilot's seat were suspended by a gyroscope. When she reached the desired safe distance, the machine stopped and Saldies peered out of the opening in the front, nodding at the slowly tightening ring of librarians. See? She asked brightly. Several of the shuffling grey figures adjusted course toward her. Her smile died and her eyes went wide. She sat back quickly in her pilot's seat, staring at me, her pair of black rats nuzzling into her lap, trying to hide. I am supposed to be invisible to them, to a degree, she said, but I sensed she wasn't really talking to me. But I'm not. Oh dear. Oh dear, no no no, we can't have this. I'm afraid I may have to break my promise to you, Lady Morel. I may have to crawl back into my snail shell and see you when this is all over. I do wish you the Saldies. I snapped at her, more irritated than afraid. Don't you dare. I'll never. The best of luck with surviving. Perhaps you can translocate yourself out for a few hours until they lose interest, no? Well, best of. Oh, fine. I huffed. I suppose she had a point. She was willing to help, but not risk her life. I rolled my eyes and prepared to leave. Hastur. The voice came from the crowding ring of squid-faced librarians, a low rumble of wet meat like an open wound used as a mouth. Saldies froze and stopped talking, face gone white as ash. We stared at each other for a split second, then both turned together, she all but clambering out of her shell to get a better look. The rat swung from the front of her dress, scrambling up to perch on her shoulders. The ring of squid-faced librarians was drawing closer and their robes were bulging and twitching with awful life beneath. Hummocks and humps and writhings stirred the fabric. As we watched in horror, the motions began to part the ragged gray down the middle, first on one librarian, then another, then a third, like insects ripping free from spent cocoons. Hastur. The voice came from among the crowd, from 20 hidden mouths ripped in gray flesh. Hastur, one of them gurgled. Third time's the charm. The closest librarian suddenly twitched and convulsed as a yellow tentacle poured out from between the gap in its robes. Slow as rancid honey, the color of old pus, about as thick as a baby's arm, the tentacle twisted in the air like a newborn creature tasting reality for the first time, clumsy and awkward. Its surface flowed with protoplasmic change, as if trying to sprout suckers and claws and sensory organs. Another tentacle joined it, then another. The librarian fell over in a heap on the floorboards, writhing and jerking as its body was given over entirely to the parasite. A second librarian fell too, yellow tentacles bursting forth like the petals of a flower rooted in a corpse. A third went down the same way, lashing at the floor, though at the back of the crowd I saw the spell weaken and break. The rearmost librarians were scattering and running now that the unseen presence had manifested in the sacrificial flesh of their comrades. Had I brought this parasite here, when I spoke the name and purged the infection from my own body? The tentacles did not reach for us right away, but found each other first, touching and groping like mating slugs, then binding together into one flesh, melting into each other and becoming one. The host bodies of the fallen librarians were rapidly consumed with yellow rot, their own flesh donated to the growing mass in front of us, wringing us, all around us. The air tasted like fungus and sulfur, making me cough. My eyes stung. A whine beyond human hearing made the inside of my head hurt. And the rest of the possessed librarians were still shuffling toward us. Without hesitation, I slipped the squid skull over my head, taking refuge inside the bone metal. My eyes stopping stinging and my breath cleared instantly. The forest knight pushed me back toward Saldies, axe leveled, nowhere to go. Saldies sat back, took a sharp breath, slapped herself twice on both cheeks, and snapped her attention to me, speaking very fast. Let's stop beating around the bush, Lady Morel. Heather. Can I call you Heather? Obviously. I squeaked. But this is hardly the time to. Can you use your powers of traveling without moving to take us both straight to the library entrance? Us? But I cast a glance at the tentacles and the librarians, the closing ring. Some of the limbs were taller than the bookcases now, their flesh flowing like candle wax. You want to come with me? She clapped her hands together with a frozen smile. I would be delighted to accompany you all the way to an audience with the king, as long as it is away from this spot. And quickly. Right, okay, but I can't just take us straight to the entrance, because I've never been there. I don't know what it looks like, where it is, anything about it. I have been there. Once, when I arrived, Saldies announced quickly, hands grasping the air in front of her. Is that enough to work with? If not, anywhere else is acceptable too. I have no idea. Saldies shrugged, a rather fatalistic smile on her lips. The rats clung to her shoulders. Well, we can give it a shot, or I can close up and run like hell. She waved a hand at the tightening ring of librarians and their strange yellow parasites, the former still shuffling closer and the latter waving in the air like strange carnivorous plants. The bookcases of the clearing were barely visible between gray and yellow now, but our would-be captors were still just beyond range of the forest knight's axe. I suspected he was more than capable of defending me against the librarians themselves, but not against whatever was riding them. The growing mass of yellow flesh could simply have engulfed him, axe and armor and all. I think I can slingshot us back out of the library and to the entrance. I hiccuped. If I can sort of process the history of everywhere you've been. Maybe. Oh, actually, I have no idea if I can do that. I'm hungry and exhausted and we're running out of time and we need to. Well. Hurry up, then. Do it. Saldies said. I'm assuming I'm going to need to close up my front here anyway. I don't want to be dragged unprotected through whatever medium you use. Yes. Yes, yes. Keep your eyes closed, at least. I nodded, stepping closer to her sphere machine and touching it with hand and tentacle alike. Behind me, the forest knight clapped a hand on my shoulder, anchoring himself, ready for the slip. Go ahead, seal up. No, wait. Saldies blinked at me as the blocks of matte gray began to move. They paused mid-flow. What about your rat? I asked. The one you sent after Sevens? We can't leave him behind. Matzogner? Oh, he'll be fine. Saldies waved both hands. He'll find his own way back to me, he always does. The rats on her shoulders bobbed their heads in agreement. The blocks started to flow closed again. Saldies, this isn't going to work. I squeaked. Several of my tentacles flew forward to hook the edges of the gray blocks, like grabbing a door before it closed. The block stopped again and Saldies gave me a deeply impatient, wide-eyed, almost panicked look. In the best of times I could do this, but I need something to go on. Somewhere to go. I don't know the location, and if I get this wrong I could pass out and we'll both be stuck here, with this. Behind me, a great swish of parting air heralded the forest knight swinging his axe one-handed. I cringed and braced for terrible violence, whirling to look, tentacles ready to defend myself against the press of gray bodies and explosion of parasitic yellow. But he had only brought the axe down horizontal, pointed at the chest of the nearest librarian. It didn't react in the slightest, beginning to press itself against the head of the axe like a puppet being walked into a wall, blind and unfeeling. Then it twitched and a tentacle eased out from between splitting robes. The knight brought the axe back, ready to strike. I can gift you a memory, Saldies said, in the exact tone of somebody offering to break all my bones. I spun back to her. You can. Is it dangerous? Oh. See consent. Even in the grip of a crisis I felt myself blush, but I fumbled the mask off and back into a cradle of my tentacles. My eyes watered in the open air and my bioreactor spun up, fighting off unseen pathogens. Saldies leaned all the way out of her machine and brought her face to within 12 inches of my own. No matter how irritating and egotistical, she was a strikingly beautiful woman, with full red lips now gently parting before me, her hand about to brush my cheek. My heart skipped more than a beat and I found myself frozen to the spot. What did she mean by intimate? Was she going to kiss her memory into me? This is too silly, you can't be serious, I said. Stop joking. This is an emergency, Lady Morel, she said quickly, husky and low. Give me your consent and allow me to touch your face. I steeled myself. We had to get out of here. I had to find Lozzie, I had to beat the hands, I had to get back home. I would have slept with Saldies if that's what it took. I didn't for a second believe she had engineered this to trick me. I swallowed on a very dry throat. Okay, I said. Okay, do it. Yes, quick. Best close your eyes, too, she whispered. Works better that way. I closed my eyes, heart slamming inside my ribs, fear crawling up my spine. Behind me, the forest night pressed against my back, retreating further from the ring of waving yellow tentacles. I heard another 3 thumps of limp bodies as librarians went down, followed by the slick wet curl of freshborn tentacles throbbing into the air to join the rest. Lips parted, blushing red as a tomato, I was braced for an emergency kiss. Saldies slapped me across the cheek so hard she drew blood. Ah! I grunted and spluttered, blinking watering eyes and clutching my stinging face, the taste of fresh blood in my mouth again. I would have gone spinning to the floor if it wasn't for my tentacles anchoring me to the sphere machine, as well as Saldi's own firm grip on my shoulder. Ow! Saldi's face filled my vision, eyes blazing wide. Did it work? She demanded. The slap had knocked my thoughts sideways, like a hard reboot of a computer by ripping the plug out of the wall and jamming it back in again. The library in trance. Saldies raised her voice in the manner of speaking to an elderly person who had refused to use their hearing aid. She shook my shoulder, rattling me back and forth. The entrance, Lady Morel. Can you picture the entrance? You just slapped me, that didn't do. An image burst into my mind, fully formed and too detailed, more like a frame from a movie than a memory, the edges too sharp, the colors too saturated, the scents too real, the taste of the air in my mouth and nose. The library entrance, a dark wooden archway, inserted into my own mind. Yes. I said, blinking in shock. Yes, I do. I can. Behind me, the forest knight's axe suddenly broke the air, slamming through meat with a wet sound of shattering bone. I flinched in surprise, my stomach turning over at the worst sound that followed tentacles slapping against metal. Then get us there. Saldies shouted. The gray blocks of her machine rolled shut, sealing her inside like a mollusk in its shell. I only pulled my tentacles out of the way at the last second, heart hammering in my ribs as I dared a glance back over my shoulder. The nearest of the fallen librarians had sprouted a clutch of yellow tentacles too, and these were tangled with the knight's axe as if trying to pull it from his grip. One of the thick yellow tendrils whirled around as if to point at me, waving in the air like a cobra rearing to strike. I hissed at it. Long and loud. Spitting a little blood, I placed one hand on the rough gray surface of Saldi's machine, made sure the knight was still gripping my shoulder, and closed my eyes. The familiar old equation spooled free like loose magnetic tape, burning through the flesh of my hands as I desperately wrapped it tight around the false, foreign, unfamiliar memory, as I looped and knotted and pulled it tight, anchored it hard, and let go. In the last second of consciousness before reality folded up, I felt an extra, unexpected weight along with Saldi's and the night. Those yellow tentacles were anchored to me, through the night, through the axe they were wrapped around, through the librarian flesh they were using as a vehicle for physical manifestation, all the way back to whatever Hastur was. I had a feeling I was already meeting the king in yellow, perhaps he was not best pleased with his daughter's choice of partner. The library collapsed. Out I went, with an unwanted passenger.